So we actually have a little bit less in the way of events and podcasts and so on. But if you do look at the calendar, go back and look at the last few weeks, because most of those links, while they allow registration initially, now they'll have the recorded copies of that same content. So you can always go back and catch up if you missed it the first time. Okay, so we've hit 4 o'clock. We're going to get started in the conversation. For those who joined us a few minutes early, I'm just going to run through a few things again. So our space is really about talking about the methods of open source intelligence, but of course also the consequences, in that most of us have come to it and have a keen interest in what's happening in Ukraine. So we'll start off, if you look at the first tweet that's in the nest right now, that includes a brief agenda for what we're going to run through. I'm going to start by running through a few resources and then a couple of good examples from just the last 3 or 4 days of OSINT work, just to give you an idea of what it looks like, some of the great accounts to follow. And then we'll move on, do a quick highlight of some of the summaries of the overall situation in Ukraine, and then we'll move into these questions. So the questions I was hoping to discuss today are, what's the situation in Bakhmut? I was actually in a space with OSINT Defender last night, co-hosting with him briefly as news was breaking. Then hoping to chat about, has the offensive against Ukrainian infrastructure failed? Which I think is a hopeful, maybe in some ways provocative question. Then I wanted to get into some of the events connected to China, because they've been active, both with regard to Ukraine and Russia in the last week. Move on to a quick economics issue, which is, are we making any progress on efforts to seize Russian assets? There were a couple of developments this week. Some progress there is slow, but I'm hoping to get into a broader conversation about policy. And then finally, I was hoping to maybe do a little bit of collective brainstorming, in that many people are anticipating a Ukrainian offensive that may begin at the end of March or early April, once the spring muds have become less of an issue, and how it's possible for those who are interested in following the developments there closely can do that with OSINT techniques, but in a way that doesn't breach operational security, because obviously that's always a concern. This isn't me presenting techniques. I'll obviously have my own thoughts, but I am hoping to generate a lot of discussion around that, and sort of brainstorm and share options so that we can be as up to date as possible when the news starts to flow in. So that's the agenda. For those who weren't listening, actually, of course, I forgot for a moment. I just spent the last 2 hours with some experts on the events in Ukraine. Well, that space is put on by the group called Tochny, which I believe stands for accuracy, and they're doing a commendable job at getting thoughtful conversations focused entirely on Ukraine out there. It was a good conversation today. It's the second item that's in the nest. They're holding their spaces at 2 p.m. Eastern time each Sunday, which works well. A lot of the people who are keen to listen to them might come to listen to us afterward, with the idea that they're focused on Ukraine, and we take a little bit broader view of open source information generally. Today, a lot of the topic will be focused on Ukraine. Hopefully we don't have too much duplication, but we are open to discussing projects that are looking at developments, whether it be in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and around the world, and the methods that those develop, the methods that some of those great investigations can demonstrate to us. If you click through that link, I believe their recording should be up now. So for those who weren't here with us in the first few minutes, Jacoby, maybe you could just explain the concept of the calendar briefly again, because I think it's pretty handy to get all those items in one place.
Sure. So we have a dynamic calendar that we are curating that includes spaces, events that are scheduled that we find of interest among people that often frequent this space. And in addition to that, we also try to follow public events that are interesting to us or that are brought to our attention by others. And so we have sort of two calendars that are mashed up into one for the benefit of anybody who is interested in either spaces here on Twitter or events elsewhere. And those events might be in one particular locale, they may be online or both. And you'll see there's a color differentiation. The blue tend to be for spaces here on Twitter, and the green tend to be events outside of Twitter. So you can go into that calendar and interact with the event there, register for events, or put it on your own calendar. Let us know if you think that we should add something to it. We'd be happy to consider that. And
I'm sure that many of the listeners have had the same frustration. If you frequent spaces, the search function for spaces via Twitter is not good. In that sometimes you'll even know that an event exists, and you'll go to search for it, and the search algorithm just won't return something you know exists. Which is why we wanted to make sure that those who are interested in the Ukraine issue can stay abreast of, because there are several people who do host from time to time, even some impromptu spaces, and so even those that have passed, we'll try to incorporate them there so that if there's a recording, you can always go back and check it. And as Jacoby had suggested, we are hoping to solicit people who are keeping an eye open for these sorts of things and might draw them to our attention. So if you're interested in that, perhaps don't start sending them to us right away. But if you'd like to kind of volunteer and say, I'd be keen to help out in some small way, message either Jacoby or I, and we would love to have your help.
And I just point out that that's a screenshot. Again, it's repeating what I said earlier, but in case you didn't hear it, the screenshot is just a snapshot in time, but right next to it is a live link. So that should give you the events that are all updated on that resource for you.
Thanks very much, Jacoby. So I was then hoping to chat about some of the resources that came up this week that are OSINT related. And I've been chatting with a few people about them. I know that Exit had a look at a few of these, and I was wondering if you could just give our audience a description of some of these tools.
I can do that. So one of the things that you had listed in resources was actually an article by Inside Over, which actually featured two of the people from Oryx that work with his team. And it basically just focuses on the technological advances that we've seen in the last year on the battlefield in Ukraine. And specifically, the two that it mentioned that I thought were really interesting. The first one, Constantine, I think it was, had brought it up maybe last week or the week before, about precision guidance munitions being especially useful. But he was talking about the artillery fired mines, and that I think we had a discussion about how we were watching a video of some Russian tanks go in and they were hitting mines, and then other tanks were trying to go around them and hitting more mines. And the thing that I think it was Constantine said was that even though areas are being demined one day, Ukraine can then use these precision guided artillery fired mines to remine that exact same area, and somebody at the Russian side might not understand that that's actually happened already. And so therefore they're assuming that they're running through an area that doesn't have a minefield and hitting a whole bunch of mines, which is a real issue. Wolverine, did you want to speak on that?
Go ahead, Wolverine.
I was just speaking about on the mines. So typically the mines, the munitions that these artillery rounds fire, where there's, being the 155s, or if they do use them with the HIMARS, typically those aren't big enough to cause like catastrophic damage to a tank. Maybe throw a tank, maybe throw a track or something like that. But like if you look at some of the videos, and from Bakhmut, where they show the tanks going up to the tree line, and then they're hitting a mine and being blown up. Those are legit actual anti-tank mines, and those are actually pretty big. They're probably 18 inches in diameter, and probably anywhere from about 5 to 7 inches thick. And they're filled with high explosive, a penetrator rod, and stuff like that. So when you think submunitions, like especially like that coming from artillery rounds, usually those are more effective against like personnel, or if you have like lightly armed vehicles, or let's say you have an artillery battery in position. Those type of munitions are very good for those. But when you fire those especially like the 155s, the tanks aren't really going to be affected by those at all. The BMPs might not even be. Um, they would probably be more those types would actually be more affected by the infantry having to go on the ground, not the heavy armor. And so that's one thing people have to realize is when you deal with those, whether it's there's different names for it. They call them fast cam. I've heard that term before, which is family of area scatterable mines, submunitions, and stuff like that. But when you actually look at some of the ones, especially like in the beginning of the, more towards the beginning of the war when all this happened, there was a bunch of videos coming out saying they're using these submunition ordnance by the Russians, and they're small. They're not really that big. In the military, we sometimes call them toe poppers because they're so small, and you hit them, you step on with your toe and it blows your foot off and stuff like that. But I mean, they do have some of that. They say they are anti-tank, but they just don't do the damage like the bigger ones that you'd see around the Bakhmut area.
Yeah, it's interesting the range of items. I wonder whether when you see the video of 5 or 6 Russian vehicles that have taken damage and been abandoned in one place, are you thinking that those are artillery fired, artillery distributed? I think they call them the RAM type mines, or would you imagine those are more traditionally set minefields?
I think those are legit minefields, because, like I said, to Leo's, I mean, in that video, there's like, I think there's a total of what, 6 to 8 vehicles that are destroyed there. 2 of them I know for sure are tanks. Just with that type, I don't think that they would be hitting the artillery or HIMARS launch type, if they even had those type. But especially the 155s, I don't think they would be. Those to me look like they're legit, deliberately set anti-tank mines. And the reason I say that is the one in the tree line is actually a really good example of that one, because if you were to do that, you might actually have where a lot of those munitions could have actually hit the trees and actually detonated before you even hit the ground. So just going off of that one and kind of experience and seeing, what they do with the mines out there, I think that these Russian forces are actually running into like dedicated anti-tank minefields.
Well, thanks. I'm glad we're getting into the discussion right away. But in any event, the reason that I had highlighted this Oryx interview is that I know they are so busy tracking losses that every so often they have to tweet out and say, thanks very much for interest from the media, but our priority is tracking the losses lists, and so we can't get to all the requests. So it's as far as I've seen, fairly rare for them to give an interview like that. So if you're curious in the work they do, if you're curious about the use of these, artillery distributed mines, go and check that article out. But we had a couple of other resources this week as well. Did you want to go into a few more of them, Axel?
Sure. And I'll just say that my key takeaway from that article was actually that their conclusion was that war is evolving faster than Western militaries can respond. That was at the very end of the article, and I thought that was a really interesting takeaway. Um, I think that's probably true of a lot of wars, but probably something to keep in mind that there's just this evolution process that we're watching happening in real time, which is kind of fascinating to keep an eye on.
Hey, Exit. You kind of came broken up. Can you I didn't hear from like the kind of like the middle of your statement to the end. You kind of came in a little broken up. Could you say again from that statement that you just said?
So Exit, do go ahead and repeat yourself for Wolverine, just so you know you came through just fine for me. So if there's a problem for you again, Wolverine, it may be you, and we can always cycle you up and down to speaker. But perhaps you could just repeat the last couple of points you made there.
Yep, I was just saying that their conclusion is that war is evolving faster than Western militaries can respond. And that was the key takeaway for me specifically. Watching that happen in real time is really fascinating to me. I like the tech side of things, and so to keep an eye on what we're seeing as a new technology brought into the battlefield, and then how there's an evolution of how to respond to those things is really interesting to me.
And for those who don't know, Oryx covers military hardware of all kinds. He's best known for having begun the list and managing that team. But if you haven't looked at his profile, do go and check him out, because he publishes about hardware from all around the world, and a lot of rare things that you don't tend to see covered in detail in other places. In a moment, I'll put up one of his tweets so you can go straight to his profile. Engineer, go ahead.
Just on that note about learning or not learning the lessons from wars, I think it can be sometimes, there's some really interesting examples through history of overlearning certain lessons. I think the French in the late 1800s, the beginning of the dreadnought kind of period of warships, realized there was these things called torpedo boats, and that one torpedo boat that's about 40 foot long with lots of torpedoes on the side of it could take out an entire battleship, and therefore battleships are pointless, and they should just build torpedo boats. As we saw over the course of the 20th century and well, mostly the 20th century, battleships were still relevant up until about 1942, where they got overtaken by combat air. And since then, we've seen the average size of a ship kind of shrink down again. But it took a good 50 years for their predictions to come true. And when they did come true, it wasn't the torpedo boat that made the battleship obsolete, it was the aircraft. So when we look at things like UAVs or cyber or electronic warfare, it's really easy to think, this will be the new paradigm, when the reality is we've just discovered a new front, a new capability that or a new capability that needs to be generated and fought and countered, as well as maintaining your tanks, your aircraft, your infantry. At the end of the day, someone needs to take the hill with a pointy stick, but they will only take the hill with a pointy stick when they're sufficiently supported by all the other capabilities. Capabilities don't become obsolete just because there's something else on the battlefield. They only become obsolete when they are sufficiently countered and cannot generate or cannot be supported in delivering their effect to the battlefield.
And of course, it's not just armchair analysts like I am who have trouble determining, the likely course of technological development in the military, but that many countries in the last few years have had to reevaluate where they've shifted focus away from some heavier equipment elements more toward cyber elements or greater integration of UAVs. And of course, there's an ongoing debate in various countries taking various approaches as to how much emphasis to put on the new versus the old. And just to follow through on what I had promised a moment ago, if you do look in the nest, there is a link to Oryx's account. If you haven't read some of his more in-depth articles, you can follow him there. We did have a couple of other interesting OSINT related resources this week. I think there's one that's a video analysis tool. Exit, did you have any background on that one?
Video analysis tool. I don't know if I did look at that one. I looked at the GeoConfirmed website, which, just to harken back to the conversation you were just having, I found it really interesting to look at that GeoConfirmed website, and then Random, who I don't see in here right now, but he and I had a conversation earlier this week talking about what history will look like in 100 years from now. And that it's probable that some of the OSINT work that we see right now on Twitter and in other places will be part of that recorded history that people kind of look back on and view as history. And from that perspective, things like the GeoConfirmed website, they're useful to us now because they're showing where actual attacks are happening, but they might even become more useful like in 10 years from now when people are looking back on how specific battles happened, what specific decisions were made, and how those affected other pieces of the battlefield. And when you have that geoconfirmed locations for actual attacks, maybe that just kind of helped build out the picture a little bit more than we might have seen in past battles, that maybe that work wasn't done already and people had to historically go back and rebuild that information.
So for those who aren't familiar with the work that GeoConfirm does, they're really coordinating a volunteer effort. And so while they have some amazing expert, both professional and amateur geolocators who work with them, I have definitely seen lots of instances where people who do it a little bit more casually will complete a geolocation, and then they'll put up all of the evidence. They'll put up various photos with distinctive features highlighted and a GPS coordinate. And if you have done the work, you can contribute to the database that they build by putting up your evidence and then tagging them. And then they'll often retweet them and add them to their database. And it's fascinating to me to see all of these efforts, because this is similar in some ways to Oryx's team, where it's a group of volunteers who are doing it in their spare time, who are collectively building a really impressive set of data. And they were focused on doing the search up front. They weren't focused on the infrastructure. How do we archive it? How do we make it readily searchable? Because when you only have a few dozen or 100 entries, it's a lot easier to do than when you have thousands. And so I'm glad to see that they're putting in the work to build some infrastructure around the good effort that they have built. And because they do take sort of volunteer contribution, whether you do geolocation or otherwise, if you're interested in the work they do, reach out to them. They may be able to make use of the skills you have. Jacoby.
Just harkening back to the conversation we were having with Wolverine, I noticed, Wolverine, you put something in the nest on landmines. Did you want to speak to that?
Now, it's just an example of one of the anti-tank landmines that they were using. These are actually Danish ones, Danish ones. So I didn't see those ones before, so I just kind of putting up there as a type of anti-tank mine, because most of the time I've seen the Russian ones, which some of them are square, and they got like two different kinds. I had to look up the actual names because there's so many mines out there, it's hard to keep track of them. But I was showing that was like one of the examples of the anti-tank mines that Ukraine is using against the Russian army.
Wolverine.
Thanks very much for that.
I don't know if this is the right time, Michael, but I think I'd be interested to get Wolverine's take on the Tartagami, probably saying it wrong, the tweet thread that was in your list of resources, talking about the new, allegedly this new Russian manual on how to do trench assault that's come to light.
Sure. I mean, I'm happy to let the conversation flow as new topics come up. I don't know whether Wolverine would have had an opportunity to look at that thread. So I'll go down in the resources and I'll put it toward the front of the nest. And Wolverine, if you've seen it, feel free to speak to it. Otherwise, perhaps you can just have a look at it. And if you have any thoughts on it as we get deeper into the conversation, please do come back to us and we can, start the conversation at that point.
I'm particularly
Jacoby.
interested in
if
anyone who has kind of forces, understands doctrine, understands how doctrine would be implemented in the field. If anyone can speak to that, that would be really interesting, I think, this evening.
Yeah, it's a great idea to queue those up. Sorry, go ahead, Wolverine.
I can kind of look at it and then compare it to like how we do our trench clearing in the U.S. Usually because of what my role was, I usually with the guns that support or provide suppressive fires to it, but we all had to go through the training of it and stuff like that. So I can look at it and kind of see what they're doing and see, compare how different it is from what we do and provide some input on it.
Great. If anybody who has interest in that can go away and look at it, come back with comments in a few minutes. It is now the first item in the nest. Jacoby, were you just going to flag us to that? Oh, okay. Awesome. Thanks very much. Continuing down on some of the resources, because I think these are helpful to anybody who either wants to be inspired in OSINT or may actually draw on the data in their own work. Exit, you had been mentioning that it's helpful to have this archive for geolocated, or excuse me, for geoconfirmed. I think there was also a set of data that was put up by Kupshur, some maps. Did you have a look at any of that?
You're asking about, I think, the only two I maybe missed today. I generally look at almost all the homework, but sorry, I did look at that one. That one was really interesting just from the perspective of we often see it's up in the nest. Jacoby, you're awesome. We often see a whole bunch of range of numbers for losses, and as MrBond will often say, those are all data points that we should consider, but it's hard to know the exact numbers right now. That one in particular, I just like looking at the ratios of the different phases of the invasion so far. That part was really instructive to me because even though what we've seen recently on the battlefield has been described by many as being stagnant, the actual numbers of losses for Russia are far higher in that last phase than a lot of the other pieces.
Great, thanks very much. The work that because I referred to Kupshur, who put that particular tweet up, but I don't want to overlook the fact that they work with Damien Simon and with Simtac. So all three of them are excellent OSINT sources. If you're not familiar with them, I'd encourage you to check them out. I did make mention a moment ago of another tool that came out this week. It's now the first item in the nest. And so this is a thread that discusses tools for video analysis. And while I'm not familiar with all of the tools, I wanted it to highlight it to anybody who it might be of use to. This account, Cyber Detective, very frequently is posting new tools. I'd encourage you to check that account out. And included in the thread this week, just for video tools, because the Cyber Detective covers all sorts of different tools. These video tools include options for text extraction, deep fake detection, identification of keyframes, and review of metadata. So if that's might be helpful to any of the work that you do, I would encourage you to check it out. I think that covers most of the resources from the last few days. I often like to then go into some of the good examples of OSINT work from the last week. So we'll start putting a few of those tweets up in the nest. One of which has already been referred to, so it's up there. It's the thread by Tedorigami discussing the redesign of the Russian unit structure, having moved away from BTGs. So it's up there for everybody to read, and I think we're going to get into a broader discussion of it down the road. So I'll leave it for now. There were a few other interesting ones. There was one that was a big count of losses that had occurred in the south. Did you have a look at that one, Exit?
I did. So I'm not a military person, and I don't pay as much attention, obviously, as somebody like Wolverine or lots of you others pay attention to what happens specifically on the battlefield. But every once in a while, something like that thread crosses my attention. And I maybe, like, anybody correct me on this if this is a bad take, but it kind of astounded me how similar the counts and the tactics that you could watch in the actual video seemed compared to in the early days when they were advancing on Kyiv, and we saw that giant convoy of Russian vehicles, tanks and otherwise. And maybe Ukraine couldn't respond as fast there, and they didn't have, like in the previous, when they were advancing on Kyiv, maybe they couldn't respond as fast, and maybe they didn't have the same speed of visuals, so like not having drones up in the air and things like that, as they do now. But it seemed to me like the tactics that we were watching were just a continuation of the problems that they had earlier, and that they really haven't fixed or changed any of their training to deal with that. Whereas I know in some of the other spaces this week, we've talked a lot about how Ukraine has been changing a lot of their training. They're getting training from NATO forces and moving, just kind of moving their tactical abilities up to a new level. And it felt to me watching that losses thread like we just are not seeing that from Russia at all. But anybody correct me on that?
The first post in the thread is up there, and you can see they're circling losses and counting them up. If you scroll to the end, I think they got up to 96 just around Vuhledar, which is amazing, as in shocking, but also obviously hopeful for Ukraine. And it's these sorts of visual losses that at the beginning of the war, when people thought about the might of the Russian army, I really think that it was threads similar to this, particularly as spearheaded by Oryx, that made people realize, once you started to put numbers to it, wow, the Russian military is not the juggernaut that it was taken to be. And so while we may have become accustomed to it now, I think that it's still, critically important because it can reveal these, levels of weakness on various fronts that you might not appreciate when you just hear about movement on a map. When you can actually put numbers of vehicles to it, it's a different tone. Sorry, I'm not sure I will pronounce your name right, but Sion, did you want to speak to this?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
You're coming through just fine.
Perfect. So I'm coming from the perspective of I'm basically a casual to this war. Like, I'm pro-Ukraine, of course, but I'm not following everything, the military stuff. Like, I have no military background, and I just want to know, who's winning this war? Overall, I hear all this stuff, Ukraine's doing this, Russia's doing that, but in your opinions, who's actually winning this war? Who's advancing more? Who's doing more stuff? Who is actually winning this war at this moment in time?
Sure, we can take a bit of a diversion onto that subject for a moment. If other people would like to speak to that sort of high level question, feel free to request the mic and come up and add your thoughts. I will say that there are several resources that we've already highlighted that you might find helpful in understanding that. So, for example, if you look at some of the archived maps that are put together by Kupcher, it's in the Nest, or if you go and you look at the account of Oryx, who has been tracking losses, you can, see evidence and numbers. So I may be a little bit behind, but I know that Oryx now has the Russians. I can't recall the number. What is it? Something like 1,500 tanks have been lost. So you can start to put quantities behind these issues. I'll let OSINT engineer come in with his comments before we go back to my thoughts on who's winning. Go ahead, engineer.
So it depends what you mean by winning. You could argue that Russia has taken a significant chunk of land and secured Donbass, but that isn't winning even by Russian standards. So if you take the Russian definition of winning, which even at its most generous is the complete annexation of Luhansk, Donetsk, and Kherson regions as they've now defined them as part of Russia, they're not winning. So in terms of who has what land today, they have not succeeded by their own standards. If you took them on if there's a really good Perun video that I will point you towards where he talks about the kind of more grand strategy of what they're doing right now. And in that video, he illustrates the point, which I think is very good, in that if Tucker Carlson got elected president tomorrow and all US aid to Ukraine was withdrawn, Russia still manages to steamroll the country, they will take over somewhere that is so vociferously opposed to them that it will make Afghanistan look like a tea party. There will be partisan attacks. There will be so Russia will basically have to garrison Ukraine in order to control its population. All of its industrial resources that it would have wanted to take, secure, utilize, say the Mariupol steelworks, the Azov-style steelworks, completely gone. Will take billions of dollars, let alone rubles, to become functional and produce economic output that Russia could claim is paying them back for all the damage and all the vehicles lost and all the men lost. And then you consider all of the soft power that Russia has shedded and traded away in order to make this war happen. All of the countries that would have otherwise turned a blind eye on the basis of they can still do a deal with Russia and get cheap oil or cheap wheat or whatever else, are now forced to choose. And will always be looking twice at Russia going, well, you can send me this today, but can you send it to me tomorrow? And can I pay you in dollars? Maybe, and no. So even if Russia was to complete their kind of land-based objectives in the next 6 months, which is unlikely, they've still lost on a geostrategic level. So it depends what you mean by lose. And by most measures, Russia's probably lost.
Wolverine, you had your hand up. Did you want to speak to this question, or were you going to speak to the other thread?
Both, but I can also speak to this one. As OSINT engineer, sorry, been a long day already. As OSINT engineer said, winning or losing is defined by what your objectives are, right? So let's say that, okay, Russia's goal is to, which we all know is to completely take over the whole Donbass of the Donetsk Oblast and the Luhansk Oblast. All right, now, have they done that? No. Have they been able to do that without significant losses? No. The amount of manpower, the amount of material, logistics and everything like that that they have lost is appalling in many ways. If it had been the United States going on and something like that, the United States would have already withdrawn and said this is not attainable, and would have pulled out. I think that any country with a sound leader, after the type of losses that the Russian army has sustained, would have pulled out a long time ago. And as we've seen, so if you go off of that, like, hey, this is what our goal is, they've lost, or they haven't technically lost yet because they're still fighting, but they are not meeting the expectations, and they are not meeting or completing the or obtaining the objectives that were stated out in the beginning of this one. So in that aspect, they're losing. And then if you go to the Ukrainian side, well, I mean, you have an army that is, 3 times smaller in the beginning compared to what the Russian army is. Probably 2 times less as equipment and everything else like that. But with all that going on, yes, initially the Russians were able to gain advances into Ukrainian territory, but a lot of it was because they had already staged 190,000 troops going there. Now, once they did, and they did cross in, yes, the Ukrainians did get significant losses in territory in certain areas, but after a certain point, which we saw especially around the Kyiv area, when the Russians were not able to get Kyiv, especially when they thought it was going to be a 3-day operation, and they were forced back. And then if you go on to now the counteroffensive that they did up in Kherson and in Kharkiv, okay, so what the Ukrainians are denying Russian the territory that they want and that they need to complete their goals. And because of that, when you can sit there, when you look at the material compare on the Ukrainian side, I mean, I know the Ukrainians have lost. No one actually knows the numbers yet, but just you compare, to the Russian army and to the Ukrainian army, I don't think that the losses are that high. One, because with the Ukrainian side, not everybody may be as well trained, which is not actually a huge thing right now as active duty guys. But the thing that gets the Ukrainians through, which the Russians lack, is morale and competent leadership. So when you take all that stuff into effect, that right there shows that the Russians, even though they're progressing, they're only progressing, 100 yards a day, 100 meters a day. I mean, how can you say that's progress? It's not, especially when you sit there. If you sit there and you had to, in order to gain that 100 meters of territory, you lost 600 troops, some tanks and IFVs. Well, what kind of progress is that? It's not. You're actually doing worse for yourself because you're losing all these resources, manpower, material for meters at a time. So when you take a look at all those different things like that, and what the objectives for the Russian is with this special military operations they call, I am gonna go on to the fact that the Russians are actually losing. They're losing more than what they're getting out of this one. The Ukrainian army is actually gaining the upper hand, more or less because of the fact that they've actually been able to keep Russian forces from obtaining their objectives with less manpower and less equipment, less munitions, and stuff like that. So I would have to say that the Russian army is the one that is severely losing because of that. The other thing I had is, I'll wait till you get back about it, is that Russian thing about the assaults and the trench warfare and all that fun stuff.
Yeah, I appreciate that. We'll definitely come back to that in a little while. We'll go to Paulie, and then we'll come back to Sion. Go ahead, Paulie.
Thank you, Michael, and greetings from Helsinki, Finland. I think I would divide these so-called wins into 2 categories. Short-term and small-scale wins, and then long-term and wide-scale wins. And I think in the beginning of war, the Russians were able to capture some land and commit atrocities, genocide, and kidnap children and babies. Of course, we can contemplate what kind of win is that, but that's in quotes their so-called wins. And whereas the Ukrainians have they have fought really well, and they have sunk in Moscow. They've been able to commit a lot of men to many fronts. They've been successful on the mobilization and the morale, and the fight to will is, I would say, all-time high in Ukraine. They've been able to make a bond or gather all the troops and all the people together. That's at least in my books, that's a really good achievement. And they've basically destroyed the VDV forces, special forces that the Ruskies had. They have destroyed a huge amount of vehicles, special equipment, and of course a lot of Mobics. So these are, in my books, really big achievements. Whereas Russia, they have claimed that prior to the full-scale invasion, they were basically broadcasting that they are the second best army in the world. And now the whole world has seen that they are not. They are a joke. And I think we have clearly seen that even from the Stan countries, let's say from Azerbaijan, I think even those countries are now openly against Russia and openly basically communicating that we will not play any games with you, and you can go to your own corner and play alone with North Korea and maybe Belarus. And I think, in my opinion, it's really important to notice that in long term, Ukraine has now over 50 Western countries behind it. And you still have to remember that, all right, Ukrainian forces, they've been really committed after 2014 to train in a Western way. And you also have to remember that for the last 12 months, they've been training more and more, getting more and more modern equipment. But the most important part is to remember that on the long term, they are now just getting the newer equipment, and it's coming in now. Whereas in the long term, the Russian equipment is deteriorating. They don't have any new equipment. They are bragging that they can develop and manufacture new equipment, but they cannot.
hopefully will run smoothly. I know I had last heard Pauly, but I'll leave it to my co-host to figure out if had Pauly finished his comments, or did we want to go to Sean?
Polly, I think we'll go to Sean and then we'll come back to you if that's all right. Go ahead, Sean.
Hello again. Yeah, so again, like I said before, I'm a complete casual to this war. Like, I'm pro-Ukraine, of course. But the Battle of Bakhmut, what is this thing, what's the significance of this? Like, they've been battling for this town for many, many months, and it looks like the Russians are going to take it in the next few days. But, like, what's the objective? Like, do Ukraine want to hold this, or is this like a big win for Russia? Like, I don't really understand the significance of this.
Well, there have been many articles written about how it seems like it's almost a pointless venture that they've been throwing so much manpower at Bakhmut. I know that there was a great conversation about that in the earlier space held by Tochny. So if there were points raised there that anybody in the audience would like to come up and add, feel free. Wolverine, you have your hand up. Did you want to speak to the significance of Bakhmut?
Yeah. So realistically, Bakhmut is more a political and a kind of like a morale thing.
That's doubling back. And go ahead, Wolverine.
So it's a political and a kind of like a morale kind of like / motivation thing, because initially, we've been seeing the fighting going on in Bakhmut for quite a long time. Bakhmut and Avdiivka, through that area right there, were like the two big areas, but it really didn't get a lot of the attention because we had a lot of, we had first all the fighting going up by Kyiv. Then we had the counteroffenses up through Kupiansk and down by Kherson and all that stuff. So for a while, it was just kind of like, okay, yeah, we know the fighting's going on there, but no one really paid attention because of all the other stuff. Now, recently, it's gotten more and more because of Wagner. So Wagner has been sitting here trying to basically use it as a point for them, saying, hey, we're the ones who got here, we're the ones who did this. And what is basically happening right now is the MOD is actually kind of taking that thunder away from Wagner and saying it's a Russian victory. And it's a lot of that has to do with the issues that are going on right now between Wagner PMC and the Russian MOD. But the thing is, this is the reason they've been pouring in is they need some kind of victory. They have not had a victory in God knows how long that has been significant in any way, shape, or form. And if they can get Bakhmut, they don't care how much they lose, as in personnel or equipment, as long as they get Bakhmut, that's going to be a symbolic victory for them, saying, hey, yeah, we can sit there and we can kick the crap out of the Ukrainians. But at the losses they suffered during that whole area has just been so horrendous. It's like I said, any practical tactician would have said, screw this is not worth it. And especially when you look at the amount of troops and the unit sizes compared to of the Russians compared to what the Ukrainians have had, it's off. The Ukrainians have not pushed anywhere near as many troops in there as the Russians have, because usually when you're in the defense, you don't need as many troops as you do as the offensive side does. But that's the big thing about it is Bakhmut may be the only place, and that's still if they can take it, is the only place that the Russians can sit there and say, yeah, we won here. We took Bakhmut. We secured it from the Ukrainians. It doesn't serve really a tactical advantage for them, nor a strategic. as Intel Schizo had pointed out in another space, there's not that many rail lines that go through there. Yeah, they've got some of those mines there and stuff like that, but there's really not otherwise a whole lot there that is, advantageous for a combat unit to take. It's just sitting in the way. But because Wagner has been fighting there, and Wagner is saying we're doing this by ourselves, we're doing it without support. Even though they have technically been getting support from the Russian army, but they keep on saying Wagner forces have done this, or Wagner forces have done that, and it's worked now against Wagner forces because Gerasimov is actually basically trying to put that wedge between Wagner and MOD and separate them because they don't want them to take the credit. So if you look at a lot of the postings coming from the Russian side, there was one, I think it was a couple weeks ago, where it was basically like Gerasimov was saying Russian forces along with volunteer units or volunteer elements, I can't remember the exact term, but those volunteer units, volunteer elements they were referring to were the Wagner PMC. So they were saying, yeah, with these guys, we're getting closer and closer to taking Bakhmut, but it is only a political and motivation and scoring points for the Russian MOD. That's all it has. When you look at the amount of losses and personnel, equipment, and how much munitions they had to take for it, Bakhmut is not worth all that stuff that they've expended to try and take that one area.
Thanks very much, Wolverine. You make some great points. Jacoby, did you have a point?
If we want to wait on this a little bit, we can, but I did want to circle back because our conversation started, as it often does in your spaces, Michael, with a look at some OSINT resources, and we had a question from somebody watching the stream on YouTube. So I don't know if you want to take that now, or we can keep.
Wait a minute, we're on YouTube. We're on YouTube again.
So there is a friend of the channel who is interested in making these conversations more widely available. And so it's not exactly our effort, but yes, the audio here, just as it's recorded on, it's being broadcast on Twitter, it's being restreamed on YouTube at the moment. And I think Jacoby can probably find a link for that, just in case you guys want to check out how it appears there, because we're essentially working on a product that will give us a few more options down the road. And this is the first trial run of that. So do go and check it out.
No, I just wanted to make sure that I didn't get upset with somebody and go off on a rage or tangent and get too explicit, and someone might get horrified by what I'm saying.
So the production team refers to the mute button as the Wolverine button. So they're way ahead of you.
Are you kidding me?
You'll never know.
It's a term of government if it is.
In any event, to your point about scheduling, so I appreciate the comments both from Wolverine and Polly. I see we've lost Sean, so we'll move on. I did want to run through one or two more of the examples of good OSINT because I think they're very interesting. We'll try and do that quickly, and then we'll move back into general discussion, including a discussion of that Tatarigami thread that OSINT Engineer brought up, because I would love to hear people's thoughts on that. I'm just looking at where we were in the examples. Okay, so I'm adding to the nest. The first item that should appear in just a moment is a study of Russian cruise missile and I think drone attacks against Ukrainian energy infrastructure. Just to highlight that. Exit, did you have a look at this?
I did. I have been following that kind of closely because I follow the energy stuff a little bit closely. And I found it really instructive, actually, to look at that and understand where they were targeting and where they were not targeting. If you look at that map, it's now the second back in the nest. It's really good at explaining that there's actually very little targeting around Odessa, even though some of the targets in Odessa have created long, wide-ranging problems there. But you actually look and a lot of the targeting isn't there at all, which I thought I didn't really understand that from the reporting that I've seen around. So this map was really instructive to me. And I'll also just note, kind of as a side note to this, and it'll come up later in your discussion, I'm sure. Ukraine Energo, sorry, who is kind of the national provider for energy, came out today, I think it was, with a release saying that basically the last 2 weeks they've had steady power in almost the entirety of the country, which when you look at the numbers and you look at that map of where these attacks have been happening, that's really quite impressive that they've been able to recover so much already.
I would say we can't speak too soon on that one potentially. OSINT Defender is reporting apparently there is Shahid 136s inbound as we speak, which is not good. Air defences over Chernihiv are having a good time trying to deal with that problem now.
That's one of the questions that hopefully will go round through in discussion, is whether the Russian attack efforts on Ukrainian energy infrastructure have as a whole failed. And while Shaheds may be inbound, the UK Ministry of Defence just the other day said they believe that the number of Shaheds still available is quite limited. So, in addition to Exit's great comments on this, it's interesting to see the curves in terms of how the efforts were much more successful in the early part of the winter, and that it seems like they really have tailed off. And so we'll get to that when we come to the question more broadly. Part of the reason I wanted to highlight this as a good example of OSINT was not only the breakdown of the data, but its presentation, which, if you're going to convey an idea to a broad audience and do it smoothly, this is a terrific graphic, in my opinion, where it's broken down the numbers on a region by region basis. It has it done by time series, and it's a very clear way to understand what has happened both geographically and through time. Exit, go ahead.
Just to add on to that, yeah, pictures tell a story way better, but also it would be really interesting to see that information overlaid on like some of the numbers of transformers and other specific infrastructure that's in those areas, so that you got a good grasp on how many targets are in those areas as well.
Absolutely. And that account, JR2, I have seen, it doesn't post as often as some other accounts, but when it does, it's excellent work. The last example I had wanted to bring up, I think I'll just run through. It's a thread by Michael Cruikshank where Russia had announced several months ago they would be opening 2 tank repair facilities. And what he's done is obtain satellite overhead photography of one of those 2. And what I thought was interesting is the technique he used was he wanted to try to evaluate whether the activity at that site had increased or decreased with time. And the way that he did that was he got a series of these satellite photographs, and he used image analysis software to look for reflectivity, essentially how bright a given section of the image was. And so he's looking at the surface of the Earth. And so he decided, I bet that if I look at the parking lot of this factory, the more cars that there are in the parking lot, the more metal and glass there are, the more reflective it will be. And that the more cars there are, that should be a proxy for the number of workers who are present, which should be a proxy for the amount of activity that's being carried out. That's a chain of assumptions, but I mean, that goes back to examples you may have heard from the past where, high aerial reconnaissance would take pictures and then they would count the amount of smoke coming out of factory smokestacks and the like. Mm-hmm. So it was very reminiscent for me of that. And he has graphed it, so do have a look at that thread. And his conclusion was that because he managed to get data going back more than a year. His conclusion was that while the amount of reflectivity and therefore activity at this factory declined through the early and mid part of 2022, he believes that it wasn't in use as a tank repair at that point. It was used for other commercial purposes. And the decline was because they were shutting down the normal production processes there in an effort to convert it to tank repair. And then it increased, fairly markedly in the fall, which sort of matches the idea of it having been open shortly after September for tank repair purposes. And then, assuming all of this chain of the more reflectivity there is, the more cars there are, the more workers there are, the more activity there is. He notes that in the last few months, the amount of apparent activity has gone down, and then you can use that data point to attach your own analysis in terms of, are there fewer vehicles to upgrade for forwarding to the front lines? Are there fewer vehicles that are damaged and being brought back for repair? What reasons might there be for fewer vehicles for repair? So in any event, this is the sort of work that, to my mind, uses a fairly new technique, or at least one I haven't seen used in open source before. And at the same time, it sort of forwards, subsequent analysis regarding the ultimate supply of upgraded or repaired tanks back to the front. So I thought that was a very interesting example. I see that Jacoby has also helpfully put up a link to that YouTube channel. So if you would like to see what they're working on, it really is just a trial. Until a few hours ago, we hadn't decided we would even make it available publicly, but you can follow that YouTube link to see what they're working on there. Just before moving on to the discussion questions, to help out people like Sean who might be coming to this space and not have a great understanding of the overview of the situation, in the agenda thread here, I have just put up some of the overviews from mappers. So I'm going to add those to the nest. I'm not going to speak to them, but I always find it's a good idea, even with quality mappers. Some of them have different information sources, and some of them update at different schedules. So I always like to compare them, no matter how good any individual is. And at the beginning of the space, I also noted that I think because so many people were putting in effort around the date marking 12 months from the full-scale invasion, that some of the mappers were probably pretty tired. They had put in a big burst of effort to produce year in review. And so only 4 of them had updated in the last day, but those materials are now all available for you in the nest. So you can be kind of up to date on how things are going. The items I put up were from the Institute for the Study of War, Poulet Volant, a French account, and DEFMON. So I think that we can get into some of these questions that I've identified. The first of which is, what is the situation in Bakhmut? And I'd encourage any of our listeners to come up to contribute, in that I have not been in the news in the last 2 or 3 hours. So there might have been, last minute breaking news. If you have any of that, please feel free to come up and help us out with that. I'm adding 2 items to the nest from that tweet, or from that thread of resources, that I wanted to speak to initially. So if you have a look at those posts, part of the reason I want to spend a moment highlighting them is that these are coming from either Russian sources or Russian-friendly sources. And I wanted to make a note about how sometimes breaking news, particularly as it relates to territorial capture, will come from sources that are not friendly to Ukraine. Now, while those sources can have biases, intelligence analysis is an evaluation of all aspects of information. And so sometimes you will get breaking news from accounts that are unfriendly to Ukraine, and it, automatically dismissing them just because of the source means you may miss out on breaking details. But what's important is to filter them, which is why I'm giving you this little additional note. So I wouldn't normally follow the map that's up there is one that's produced by Rybar. The particular account that tweeted it out doesn't really matter. Rybar is one of the most famous Russian mappers. The reason I've included it there is it was the most recent map just prior to my putting the thread out. And so that gives you a sense of how the Russians had been attempting an encirclement in Bakhmut and had made gradual progress over the last few weeks at extremely high cost, as we've already discussed. But that it appeared that last night there were reports that they had made a bit of a breakthrough to the north and northwest of the city of Bakhmut. And you can see on the Rybar map, that's the sort of bright red territory. And the concern was that allowed the Russians to advance far enough that they may be exerting some degree of fire control over the last two major roads that were supplying Bakhmut. That are flowing in through the remaining open gap. So that map is up there just so that you can get a sense of at least what the claimed tactical circumstances are, however much weight you put into a Russian source like that. The other one I wanted to speak to was a similar report coming from a Russian-friendly, or perhaps maybe not Ukrainian-friendly account, where they were grabbing a post from Telegram. It's the tweet up here by War Monitors. They had grabbed a post from Telegram that they claim was put up by Ukrainian medics who were reporting that in Bakhmut, the city was under operational encirclement, and that some of the major roads in and out can only be used safely at night under the cover of darkness. So I've put that up because it's indicative. It's a data point. The other reason I put it up is this weird quirk in that on Twitter, there are actually 2 or 3 accounts that go by the handle or the screen name War Monitor. Of course, they have slightly different Twitter handles. The reason I point that out is that they have varying degrees of sympathy to Ukraine and to Russia, and that this particular account seems to be Russian-friendly. And so the example value here is to say that don't confuse them, and it's important to know the biases of your sources. But in any event, between the Rybar map
So I think we lost your audio, Michael. Is that possible? OSINT, do you have Michael's audio, or is it just me?
No, I don't. I am going to have to drop out about now, so it might be worth bringing in Polaris, who I think is in and away is down in the, what do we call it these days?
The listenership.
Yes, that one. Those other euphemisms.
I will bring him up. I'm glad you were able to stop in and co.
I will leave with one note though. The thread detailing that massive armor column in Vuhledar. Going through and looking at the various range of pieces of equipment there. There includes number 34, a BMP-4, which is a really new, well, relatively new piece of kit, 2008 circa. Was 2004 apparently is when it came into service. So, but that's relatively new by Russian standards. but there's a wide range of other bits of kit, from very basic early BMPs all the way to some newer kit. So it's interesting to see that there's a interesting range of equipment in service these days, or not in service anymore.
Can you send me? Could you send me or tag me or tag me in a tweet or something like that
we'll
with
do.
those images or video?
We'll do. Okay. Yeah. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you, OSINT. We really appreciate it, and are now back with Michael, so that's good.
Yeah, apologies for that mic issue there. I had actually finished my point on the Russian accounts. We can jump back into a discussion about the situation in Bakhmut. Again, if you've seen any recent developments there, please do come up and let us know about them. But it looks like it is likely there is an operational encirclement. However, Ukraine just this morning, let me see here, did put out, the Washington Post was covering that Ukraine is saying the city has not fallen. So it's important to note that. Two other interesting points I wanted to discuss in connection with Bakhmut were, there was the Ukrainians, in an effort to deter Russian advance, breached a dam, and they flooded an area to the north end of the city. What I've put in the nest is a tweet by Andrew Perpetua that projects the area of the city that would be flooded, and would have hopefully contributed to slowing the Russian advance. The one other item connected with Bakhmut I did want to highlight as well, and I would invite any audience, thoughts on this issue, is the fact that just a few days ago, it was announced that Prigozhin, that Russian media is apparently now prohibited from referring to Prigozhin in a positive way or in quoting him. And that's going to be very difficult for them to report on the progress of Wagner in Bakhmut, because that will be treated as, a significant victory, I'm sure, for PR purposes. But to describe all of that without describing the efforts of Wagner and Prigozhin. I've invited Polaris to join us as a speaker and hopefully in a few moments as co-host. I don't know whether any of you have seen any updates, whether Polaris or Wolverine. Have you seen any new developments around Bakhmut?
Not really. The only thing I've seen, which is kind of goes back to what we were saying yesterday with some of the when we had that big discussion between myself and Allsource, when we were talking about the lack of armor. And so I was reading ISW, and then I was actually reading Rybar, and I was actually comparing the both. And even though this is not Bakhmut itself, this is down by Volodar, and they were talking about the 155th and the 40th Naval Infantry Brigades. And a couple of things that they brought up is, one, both brigades had sustained so many losses that they actually combined the 155th and the 40th Naval Infantry Brigades to make one brigade, and then they backfilled them with troops. The other thing that was big, and this directly deals with also with what we were talking about yesterday, is that they are using less and less armor down by Volodar to support any of their attacks. It has even gotten to the point now where they're using whatever vehicles they may have, whether it be BMPs or MTLBs or BTRs. What's now happening is they're using whatever infantry vehicles they got, and they're using them more like what the United States did with the M113s, where basically, they would drive the troops up so far, then the troops would disembark the vehicles, and then they'd push forward on with their assaults. But the M113s would stay there and provides fire support and stuff like that as we needed. What's happening in the Volodar area, though, is that most of the times now that these whatever IFVs or APCs that they're sending are not even staying there and providing any type of fire support. They're actually pulling back. And I'm assuming that to keep from getting targeted and taken out by Ukrainian forces because the amount of armor that they have is nowhere near enough to actually support these. So what's happening is you're having a lot of infantry going in, and if it's happening down there with those two units, because those are some of the one of them is kind of like the naval infantry units are like their elite units anyways. If that's happening with their naval infantry units, then I'm going to suspect that a lot of that is actually happening all up in the Bakhmut area. So that would explain why we have been seeing less and less tanks, and we've seen a lot more infantry fighting vehicles or APCs getting destroyed in all the fighting up there. So that goes a lot to say with the whole situation, because that could be actually happening all the way from Zaporizhia, from Volodar all the way up to the Kremenna and Salvatore line.
Well, thanks very much for that, Wolverine. I just was taking a quick look to see if there was any breaking news. The only sort of connected note that I saw was just a few minutes ago. Apparently, it was discussed that Zelensky has removed from command Major General Moskalev, who had been commanding forces in a number of places, including in Bakhmut, which is an interesting development. Polaris, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. I was hoping to find a tweet for the list. The name of the town escapes me, but there is a town near Bakhmut that has been flooded. At least if reports from Twitter is to be taken with any credibility. From my understanding, this is the Ukrainians doing this as part of a broader defensive posture and not malpractice on the hands of the Russians. I don't know if anyone else has been able to confirm this, but I've yet to see any imagery confirming this, but various Ukrainian sources that I consider to have varying levels, but overall positive levels of credibility have spoken to this particular event.
Any confirmation of that flooding would be very interesting. I had only heard about the fact that the dam had been breached and projections of flooding, but I haven't seen any imagery either. Jacoby, did you want to go ahead?
I can't speak to that, but I wanted to bring up just a part of a question that had come up earlier from somebody in the space about GLDSMs, the ground-launched small diameter munitions, and wondering if those have been having any effect in and around Bakhmut or around other parts of Ukraine.
Sure. My understanding is that the ground-launched small diameter bombs, I don't believe they have been confirmed to have been received in Ukraine. They're a fairly new product that has been committed to be delivered by the United States, but that they have to be obtained from the manufacturer under the Ukrainian Security Assistance Initiative. So I don't think we've received confirmation that they're there. I know that there have been strikes in the last few days deeper behind Russian lines than had been readily explainable. But there are some other options for munitions that could have been used in those strikes in Mariupol, and that it's not necessarily the ground-launched small diameter bomb. But if anybody has any more conclusive news on that, I'd welcome them to come up and discuss it. Brian, did you have a comment either on Bakhmut or on the small diameter bombs?
I had a separate subject, so if anybody wants to close out that issue, then I'll wait.
Go ahead, Brad.
Hey, just something real quick. I believe we're going to talk about the Tatarigami thread on the new Russian battle formation.
We will. So if we're going to shift away from Bakhmut for a moment anyway.
I have something related to Bakhmut. So we just mentioned in Volodar this latest wave of kamikazes came in with light on armor. In the second to last tweet in Tatar Gandhi's post that we're going to go through at some point, it mentions that the part of the design of this formation is to be, armor light, so to speak. And I'm just wondering if anybody has seen anything to indicate that maybe this, certainly they don't have enough armor in Bakhmut, but I'm wondering if there's any evidence to suggest that they even attempted to roll with this new formation. Happy to put it off towards a little bit later in the conversation if that's more appropriate. But I just thought it's interesting that they're rolling light with armor. I have lots of doubts that they could even execute this new formation, but I would defer to somebody who's a little bit more knowledgeable.
It's an interesting question. I think it's fairly specific. And so if anybody has any response to Brad, do feel free to come up and chat about it. I would love, if we're switching topics in any event, I know Wolverine has taken a look at that thread. He may not have a comment on whether it's being implemented in Bakhmut, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
So the first part we were saying about the lack of the armor, that is true. One of the things that we've seen, even though it's kind of not on the front line right now, is they're actually pulling BTR-50s out of storage to potentially send them down there. So that'll give you kind of somewhat an idea of how bad it is for the Russians as far as the armor side goes. Another example of that is you've seen around Bakhmut with the Wagner Yahoos, where they're doing a lot of formations, just straight infantry, no armor support or little to no armor support. And that could be because, one, they're trying to save that armor for something else, maybe an exploitation of some sort, or it could be just that they don't have enough. Now, the thing I looked at, basically what it said is they're transitioning from the BTGs down to these assault units. One thing is that when you look at those assault units, some of them are severely lacking. Severely lacking in armor assets. Example, one of them, it showed I think it was a company level unit where they had one tank and 6 IFVs as far as their armor complement, and then 2 S9 Nonas and stuff like that, and that was it. And I think that was a company level, but the other one, it wasn't that much more armor. So with the vehicles that they're using, especially if they're using the older BMP ones that are doing these assaults, that's going to be problematic. One reason being is that when the BMP ones came out, they actually did some testing on them. I don't know if we did it or Russians did it, but somehow it was done, and they found out that BMP ones could not deflect the armor from our 50 caliber machine guns. Well, when they came out with the BMP2s, that was one big thing, is they had to make sure that the BMP2s could actually resist hits from our 50 caliber machine guns, which they are. So if they're going on this, with these 6 IFVs and 1 tank in support, that actually limits you, because typically if you want to put tanks, you at least want to put 2 tanks. That way you could be firing from different positions, covering a wider area. And then if you had to do some type of withdrawal, let's say you want to pull your IFVs out first, you could use your tanks for covering fire. And then while you're doing that, the tanks can, step back while one is firing, the other one can push back, set up in a firing position, assume firing while the other tank gets back. So if they're only going to assign them 1 tank, that shows that, they are probably hurting a lot worse than what we may be thinking if they're trying to reorganize it into that. The other problem that they're going to have is that if they're just let's say they have a unit that is technically set up as a BTG, or on paper it was a BTG at one time. The other issue you're going to have is that the Russian military does not have flexibility and as far as their leadership, their training and stuff like that compared to what the United States does. So trying to implement something like this on the battlefield with little to no practice is actually going to be more detrimental to the Russian forces, because the troops are not going to know what's going on. They haven't practiced this. They don't know where, tanks is going to be at, and all this other stuff. So I think that these formations are going to be more detrimental for them going on, just because they haven't practiced. And, anybody says that, that's why the U.S. is so good at what we do, because we practice and we're trained so much for these different missions. And just all of a sudden throwing a unit in there and doing that, I think you're going to need a lot more casualties than what they're willing to want to absorb and stuff like that. And the only other issue I had with it is that so much of it was written in Russian. Some of the terms and some of the symbols are similar to ours. Fields of fire, some of the weapon systems, stuff like that. But there's a lot of stuff I couldn't readily identify, just because it's all in Russian. And that kind of hampered a little bit, because I couldn't say exactly, okay, is this a mortar, or is this a machine gun, or what they have in support. So that was another issue, was just with it being in Russian, being able to tell what actual assets, not the vehicle assets, but what weapon systems, heavy weapon systems would be in what locations and doing what.
So what might be helpful, it's for someone to do, for those who don't speak Russian, or may not be as familiar with the unit design as Tadarigami is himself, would be to go through that thread and take the Russian text. You can use Google Lens. This is a tip for those who don't know. If you download the Lens app, it has a translate feature built into it. And so I use that pretty frequently, almost every day. If you want to translate foreign languages that are in images, because it will do character recognition quite well, where the image is clear enough. And so it would be a worthwhile project for somebody to go through, take that Russian text, convert it to English, and perhaps just post it in the replies to the Tatarigami thread, so that people like Wolverine, who would like to know a little bit more detail but might not take the time to dig into it, it's right at their fingertips. And that's the sort of thing where, even if you're not you're not doing open source intelligence work at the level of buying satellite photography, or you're not producing reports, you can go through and find something in a foreign language, convert it to English. Sometimes they'll post, OSINT accounts will post Russian decrees or Russian newspaper articles, and even just translating it to English and then dropping it in the replies to save time for the next person behind you is contributing to the general community. So I'd encourage you to do that. So Wolverine, I appreciate your thoughts on that thread. If anybody else would like to speak to it, do just request the mic. We'd love to hear from you. If you're enjoying the space, please do retweet it. We'll get more people into the conversation. Brian, did you want to go ahead? I know it was a different topic, but I'm happy to bring in something new.
Yeah, and before I get to my topic, I just wanted to, what I appreciate in particular about the satellite photography aspect of open source intelligence is that it put lie to some of this denial that was put out in right-wing media outlets in the United States, that that there was, like, for instance, that the massacres, that the mass murder at Mariupol wasn't really happening, and it was really the Ukrainians that were doing. I mean, just batshit stuff that was being propagated out there to gullible people who were lapping this up. And so it's hard to argue with images of mass graves and stuff, and looking at the destruction. So being able to geolocate and have imagery that really is in the public domain, to anyone with a credit card, really, that kind of debunked a lot of this narrative, anti-Ukraine narrative that was being cascaded out there initially. I think that was helpful to the conversation, and a lot of those folks, who were cascading these lies, it's a lot more difficult in the digital age for them to be doing this. That's my opinion. Has there been any discussion of the attack on the A-50 AWACS aircraft in Belarus? If not, I've been in some spaces this morning that kind of delved into that topic in depth, and didn't know if it had already been talked about. I had to go away from the phone for a bit.
No, we haven't brought it up in our space yet. It was discussed in the earlier space by Tochny, but for the benefit of the listeners who didn't hear it then, would you like to explain what's happened?
Yeah, so there were some reports, numerous reports from the region that there were explosions at this military airport in Belarus, and I put a tweet about it in the nest. I guess it's the second one now, and this is an A-50 aircraft that is essentially, as I understand it, a Russian equivalent of AWACS aircraft. This is apparently something that is in relatively short supply to the Russian military, and so it's kind of an important piece of equipment that can be used in offensive operations. And as I understand it, the aircraft, and there was someone who lives in Belarus who actually mentioned that she was hearing on Belarusian media that, and basically summarized in the nest, that there were parts of the aircraft that were damaged, avionics, radar antenna, to the point where there was someone who was pretty familiar with that airframe, that essentially, and Russian airframes in general, that said that essentially is going to put that piece of aircraft out of commission, and really pretty much for the duration of this invasion, because of the lack of the ability of the Russians to repair that. The prevailing wisdom seemed to be, in the space I was in this morning, that this was, and actually this was reported in Belarusian media, was that it was partisan activity that was doing that. Obviously, there's no way to know that, or were the Ukrainian special forces that crossed the border and were participating in this. I don't know, but and the prevailing wisdom seems to think also, because of the value of this aircraft to the Russians, that it was unlikely to be a false flag sort of exercise by the Russians, because they wouldn't be willing to risk damaging something like an important aircraft like this for the purposes of spinning a sort of fake narrative, as they have done many times in the past, of false flag operations. So I hope that was halfway sensible, or not. I hope it was not nonsensical, and anybody can correct me if they've got updated information, but that's my understanding of where we're at this point.
I always do appreciate people bringing up new developments. So that was terrific, Brian. Thanks very much. I know that there has been an ongoing effort of partisan action in Belarus. I know sort of during critical windows in sort of April, May last year, when some of the forces that were withdrawing from the north of Ukraine were, the equipment was being rotated around to Ukraine's east. And there were lots of reports at that time of railway sabotage. And I know that partly as a result, I believe Belarus actually changed the criminal penalty for sabotage, I believe, to include the threat of the death penalty. And so, there's clearly a lot of brave people in Belarus who are working against the Russian effort, which is great news. To your point about false flag and these being valuable aircraft, I would have to look up how many they have, but I know it's a very limited number. And so this is a particularly significant development, I think. Polaris, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I also saw this report, I believe was Brian that just spoke, said the A-50s are essentially the Russian equivalents of the AWACS. There's about 40 or so that have been built. I do know the Indians operate some as well. I'm not entirely sure how many the Indians operate, but nonetheless, the Indian contingent counts as part of the 40. And of that 40, only 7 of those in recent memory have been upgraded to the A50U standard, which makes them a bit more useful in a modern environment. So it's definitely an expensive asset for the Russians to lose. It's a bit more costly, provided this news can be verified to be true at a later date, and that's a big if, because the Russian aerospace industry really only does a good job at modernizing fuselages and airframes from the Soviet era. They have yet to actually build a large indigenous platform from scratch since the breakup of the Soviet Union. So any airframes that the Russians lose, it becomes that much more difficult for them to replace down in the near future.
Great points there. John, I think you were next.
Thank you. I would just say that people are kind of holding and waiting for some type of imagery or any type of evidence, specifically imagery, whether it's satellite imagery or imagery from the ground. I think that's kind of what we're all kind of waiting for. Now, as of 2 hours ago, there was kind of like this confusion whether it was a Belarusian IL-76. I think that's been kind of put to rest. I think that was kind of maybe an attempt by Russian actors to kind of make this like, oh, an attack on Belarus and not Russian assets. But as of 2 hours ago, Bipol, I think the Telegram, Bipol's Telegram, was reporting that it is in fact an A-50U AEW aircraft. So that's 2 hours ago, and they've been pretty silent since. Since then, I think they've only reported on something about like unrelated matters, things like Belarusians keeping their digital platforms like clean and things like that. So they've been pretty quiet on it. The statement on how Belarusian response, they did actually get out in front of that, and they said that this does not warrant a type of attack that would warrant Belarusian response at getting directly involved in Ukraine. So that's like the latest that I'm seeing right now, unless something has popped up in the last couple minutes or half hour.
That update on Belarus's response is very interesting. And John, you make a great point about waiting for imagery to be available. I know that several times there have been claims that strategic Russian air assets have been damaged, like on the attack on Engels Air Base and others. And ultimately, when some of those photographs came out, there were one or two instances where damage to a bomber were visible, but then there have been several other instances where destruction of bombers was claimed, and it ultimately wasn't backed up by imagery. Just before Wolverine, I just want to point out an excellent source for developments in Belarus is this Belarusian Hagen project. So if you look at the first tweet in the nest that Exit put up, that account is doing amazing work. Sorry about that feedback there. We just muted a mic. Wolverine, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, it's just mainly about the AWACS. So, yeah, they are right. Only 40 of them are been produced, give or take. India has 2 on order. Whether they've actually sent them down there or not yet, but that's the numbers that stand on. The one good thing as far as the AWACS goes, depending on what the damages to it are, a lot of the repairs are actually not going to be that hard to do because the A50 is basically, it's their IL-76, which they have quite a lot of those in inventory, and they're all around. So depending on what components of the aircraft actually were damaged, if it's anything with the radar, communication systems, or the system specifically built in for its mission, that could be a huge issue. But if it's like general aircraft parts, like engines or wing parts or something like that, that's something that could actually be taken care of probably quite readily. But even if they get one damaged and this down there, that's going to be a huge loss for them just because of the coverage and what the mission of the AWACS is. The other thing you got to look at is how much have they actually been using it? Has it actually been doing its actual mission? Which if it's been flying up there and not flying over Ukraine, I don't think that AWACS has actually been doing a whole lot of its actual mission. you'd have to look at what its covering range is on with its radars and stuff like that. If it's only flying like in the Belarus and in that Russian area of Belgrade, and that's it, that's a whole lot of territory that they obviously cannot cover and they cannot see just because they're staying so far up and because they don't want to fly down into Ukrainian territory. It's just like their bombers, they're not going to send their bombers across the border when they can safely use them and, take less of a chance of losing them by sending them across the border.
I appreciate those points. And then one other related item is it's not just the A-50 as an asset, it's also the degree of security at these bases in Belarus, because they have been keeping, I believe it's MiG-31s, perhaps somebody can correct me on that, but some of these standoff, these jets that can fire their standoff missiles have been launching from Belarus, of course, for months. And I would assume that they're operating from the same airfields as the A-50. And so if there is partisan activity that has been successful enough to get to the A-50, those other aircraft are at risk as well, particularly if the parties responsible, weren't caught. So that may limit their ability to operate from Belarus at least in the next little while. We'll have to keep an eye on that. But anyway, thanks to Brian for bringing that breaking news up. So looking at our agenda, I'll run on to another question. I see that we've been joined by Piotr. So maybe what I'll do is shuffle the order a little bit, because I know that Piotr has lots of background in geopolitical matters. And so one of the questions on the agenda was essentially, what is China doing? And there are a lot of aspects we can look at in connection with recent Chinese activity. So I'm going to start populating some of those items into the nest to inspire our conversation. I'll start with, it's actually the text of the Chinese peace proposal. And please do note that you can link to the full text because it's more than just the 12 bullet points. But if you link to the full text, it is a link to a Chinese government site. So, take whatever precautions you think are appropriate. Now, several things happened right around the same time that the Chinese released this peace proposal. That included, there was a G20 summit at which, a statement on the war in Ukraine, a draft was circulated to the members of the G20, and ultimately no statement could be agreed upon among the participants. And it's reported that China and potentially India objected to the text of that statement. So, on one hand, China has put out a peace proposal. On another, they can't reach agreement with many of their sort of Western peers or their Western-based peers on, what policy is acceptable. At the same time, there were also talks, or it was reported in the media, I should say, that several of the major European powers, particularly France and Germany, may have been beginning to put pressure on Ukraine to consider the conditions under which it would reopen peace talks with Russia, which, ties into China making a peace proposal at the same time. So it seems like there may be sort of competing efforts on this front. Of course, that idea of these, France and Germany and potentially others of beginning to consider negotiation is difficult to understand. Another item I've just put up in the nest was a statement that I believe the Russian Foreign Ministry had put out just a few days ago, where they reiterated their conditions for the end of the war, where they basically restated all of the majority of the positions they've held all along, including demilitarization, regime change, continuing to possess all of the annexed territories, and that Ukraine remain neutral, which of course is unacceptable to Ukraine and almost all of its partners. And so I'm mentioning these items. Hopefully, we'll get a little bit of discussion going just on the broad question of, what is China doing? What is its goal? What do we think the impact will be? If we get, I would, be interested, for example, if Piotr has any thoughts on what China's game here is, if he's with us.
Oh, he is up as speaker.
Yeah, could you repeat the question? Sorry.
Your audio, Piotr, is really, really light. If you could.
Is my audio better now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So what was the question? Sorry.
Well, to the extent that you're able to speak, I was just wondering if you would give us your thoughts on what you think China's game is in presenting this peace plan. What are they hoping to achieve?
I think it's multifaceted. I think that the Chinese did a bit of a smoke and mirrors because, as I said in other spaces in the past few days, what happened at the Munich Security Conference was quite interesting. What have we seen happen at the security conference in the past is basically, different leaders, different individuals use it as a platform to, make a symbolic move or gesture, a bit of posturing as typical at international relations level. And I think China was just the latest example of this. Think of Russia's speech or Putin's speech in 2007. I think Blinken, by coming out on whatever it was, the weekend last, and saying basically that he had evidence to suggest the Chinese are thinking of providing lethal aid, was a bit of a way to sort of force the hand of the Chinese a little bit, catch them off guard, make them perhaps they were thinking of doing this. There's not much evidence to tell, but we've seen covert and backdoor diplomacy happen in the past, and I think that this was the Americans maybe going out on a bit of a whim to try and, as I say, co-opt the Chinese to do something a little bit differently. And Sunny, because the Chinese have clearly had this peace plan for a long time. You can tell that from the way that they've focused on some of the topics. For me, it's just a little bit too suddenly that they decide to release it less than a week after a very large, quite significant, bombshell from their greatest strategical adversary, i.e. the US. So, I mean, this is my personal opinion, but I think it might have been a little bit of a sort of a move to, play damage limitation, considering they've also had to screw up with the balloon. And generally, the last thing the CCP like to be is in the spotlight. They very much like to be not in the shadows, but that's why I always think that they never really wanted the Russians to fully invade Ukraine, because what did that do? It put the spotlight immediately on, well, what happens with China and Taiwan? And they were quite happy with going around there, the Taiwanese Strait and so on, posturing and putting pressure, but it was never fully in the attention as it is now, at least among non-specialist audiences. So I think the Chinese are in a little bit of I'd say they're sort of on the back foot, but they're in a tricky situation. I think they're trying to play the calculus, as we all are. They're trying to do their version of game theory and see, how they can mitigate the damage on them or the reputational damage, divert the attention. But I also do think, my last point, I still remain skeptical that they really do want to, get involved with the war. I think that there's a large array of, questions around what China really wants from this, and the map that they brought out, discussing the idea of a DMZ in Ukraine is, I think, a little bit of a provocative move on their part. But yeah, I think there's a lot to it, and I think I think a lot of it will also be dependent by the war itself. China is reacting, as we all are, and I think as the war begins to change, a little bit on the battlefield, as we've seen in Bakhmut in the past few hours, then that may well change the calculus again. So I think the Chinese are being as proactive as reactive at the same time. Sorry for the background noise.
No, that's no problem. I appreciate your insight there. Though that's interesting. I hadn't considered it as a damage control measure. And your point about reactivity is a good one as well. I partly wonder if that maybe contributed. Many people have noted the vagueness of the lack of detail attached to that plan, And I wonder if that might partly be that it was rushed out, in connection as a damage control measure, and also intended to be vague. If it was pushed forward quickly, they didn't want to be pinned down in order to be able to respond, as you say. So I appreciate those bits of analysis. John, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, definitely. So I was talking about just real quick. I wanted to mention something I think someone had thrown up in the nest of France and Germany kind of brokering this peace on Ukraine's behalf. Kind of just seems a bit folly driven for me. I think what is still fresh in many of our minds is Macron's speaking on France. People who aren't aware about Macron or who that might be, but that's the French Prime Minister, President. His kind of like peace, thinking he was going to broker this peace deal, and it was very like Neville Chamberlain-esque, kind of waving the paper in the air when he came back. I mean, not saying that Macron did not do that, but he kind of came back in saying that he thinks that there were real advances made towards peace, and Russia kind of stepping back. And then it was very clear to all of us at the time, and then obviously weeks later when he invaded, that Putin just stared him in the face and said, "Yeah, I'm not going to invade this, that," and just stared him in the face and lied to him through his teeth, which I don't know why Macron thought otherwise. When you see France and Germany at the Munich Security Conference saying over and over again, even sometimes being red in the face, specifically talking about Elena Baerbock, I think her name is. I might be mispronouncing her name, but the foreign minister for Germany, at times getting red in the face because you could tell they were under so much pressure for, why did you actually believe them? And they still held the position that they did. They honestly believed Putin was being genuine with them, which just seems so farcical to me. But Piotr made some good points, talking about how it seems like China may have had these points, kind of shifting over to the China question, had these points for a while, and there's some things that kind of speak to that, and I think the nuclear point, I believe that would be let me bring it up real quick, point 8, talking about reducing strategic risks, and this is very indicative of the fact that they may have been having something that's been in the back of their minds, and they're talking about how nuclear forces should not be threatened, like the execution of a nuclear strike should not be threatened, neither should it be used as just rhetoric. And it's funny because they say this as they're building up their forces at exponential rates, and I think this is kind of China, kind of saying, hey, don't talk about nukes yet because we're not there yet, almost, and that's really boiling it down, really basic, just boiling down the strategic rhetoric and stuff like that. But that's really what it sounds like. It's like they're clearly not able to match other great powers, including Russia, just with their strategic nuclear forces, and it seems like they're kind of like, hey, hold off on this because their actions don't back up any of these points. It just doesn't make any sense.
Interesting. And so what I have been keeping an eye out for then is the responses from the various major players. And so I'll be adding a few items to the nest as we go through our next speaker. So keep an eye up there. But it seemed like initially Zelensky was, receptive or open. Perhaps it's better to phrase it as not openly critical. And that may have been connected with the idea that he has come out now publicly and said he would like to speak directly to Xi, potentially to make his case, maybe in connection with these reports that Piotr referred to from the United States that China is considering more openly supporting Russia, and that Zelensky wants to, he feels like he may be persuasive enough to make his appeal directly to the Chinese leader. So we will go to balance in a moment, but I see Piotr's put his hand up and he may be limited. So why don't we go to Piotr? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to participate. I'm just, in a cafe trying to do some Sunday fun day work. If people have questions, then I can. It's also annoying. I've got these headphones, but they don't seem to work. So anyway, just the other thing I wanted to point out was the the Lukashenko state visit to China. I mentioned this in a space yesterday, but I didn't know this. Lukashenko's not on just any visit; he's on a state visit to China on February from tomorrow until Thursday, and that's quite interesting. Doing their little bit of diplomatic charming, and Belarus is obviously getting in there with China a little bit. As I said, this could be interesting to see if it antagonizes Russia a little bit, if they get too friendly. But clearly, China is seeing an opportunity to have a little bit of an indirect influence in the post-World War, post-Soviet Union area that you would look at a map and think, well, what's China's going to do there? It's Russia's backyard. But definitely some things. And also, obviously, Schultz is in India today as well. He'll be back tomorrow, I think, in Germany. He's on a diplomatic mission over trade opportunities for Germany and the EU separately, and also Ukrainian support from India. So just a couple of diplomatic elements there.
Lots of interesting points there, particularly the upcoming meetings with the Chinese. To that end, I've put up German media coverage of the German response to the Chinese peace plan. Unfortunately, Welt, I think, is paywalled. So you may have to, if you're really keen to find it, you may have to take that title and sort of search for an alternative source if you're not subscribed. But the Germans essentially were not particularly impressed, and in some ways mirrored the American response, where Biden essentially said something along the lines of, well, if Russia is pleased with the Chinese peace plan, then how good can it be? Which I thought was almost an amusing response to it. I think the order here was Balanced and then Wolverine. Go ahead, Balanced.
Yeah, so not taking an opposing view to Piotr, but more so adding to the view some context. I believe if providing insight from some of the OSINT investigators and analysts that focus on China, a fair amount of focus is put on the fact that it's as important for Xi Jinping to, and I'll provide this to you, Michael, to vet, and then if you'd like to post it in the nest, you can feel free to do so. It is as important for Xi Jinping to be viewed as, that sort of statesman, putting out, government endorsed, Chinese CCP endorsed position pieces. Let's be real. I mean, reviewing it in great detail and supported by some of the Chinese CCP focused, OSINT analysts stating that this is not a peace plan. This was a position piece that's meant to bolster the image of Xi Jinping domestically, and also to a degree to countries that are subordinate to China and potentially concurrently with Russia. It's not that hard to imagine what the CCP has seen, look at, and this was some insight that was provided by one of the OSINT analysts, so I'll read it for you. He states, with the United Nations troops led by the US on the ground with the Air Force and Navy, the Korean War ended up with a DMZ. The Ukrainians have much less there with respect to creating a DMZ. So China perpetuating the situation creates a situation it could exploit. And there's quite a bit of a safety margin for China to escalate its support for Russia. So what does that mean? Ultimately stating that China could essentially feed the conflict and benefit from it in a number of ways. So somewhat of a additional context, instead of them desiring to remain in the background, exploiting the circumstances on a number of different levels for an ultimate aim to diminish the standing of Western countries globally.
Thanks very much. Wolverine, at one point you had your hand up. Did you want to speak to this?
No, actually, I did that. I didn't realize it was up.
Okay. John, go ahead.
Yeah, so in a quick response to Balance, I'd argue that China has been already exploiting this situation. I mean, obviously they haven't been, well, reports are saying they haven't been giving any lethal aid to Russia, but I just only assume that they already have been giving other types of aid. And I think just a distraction from what China is doing is a perfect thing to exploit by China. Yeah, the whole idea of China exploiting, and even when something big isn't going on, China is still exploiting things at all times. It's kind of just like their mantra. It's kind of almost their geopolitical strategy and defense strategy is exploitation, exploitation, exploitation. On the Belarusian China visit, that's something I'm actually learning about right now as well. So thank you for, I don't remember who mentioned that, if it was Balanced or Wolverine or someone else or Pure Tour, but thank you very much for that. The first question that popped into my mind is, what's China's goal? Like, so what is China, assuming, when they get behind, not when they get out front of the cameras and they get in the back room, what is China saying? Hey, okay, so this is what you need to do, or this is what you don't need to do. That's my biggest worry. Is China telling Lukashenko, hey, don't, whatever Russia does, whatever type of farcical intelligence Russia shows you, do not get involved in this. It's in your best interest. With us saying this, and obviously the impact of what China saying that to them in person would have, or China saying, hey, maybe you do need to get involved in this, and we'll back you. So this is maybe a possible turning point in the foreign policy or the rhetoric we're going to see from Belarus, or maybe the Belarusian Russian relationship. So thank you for whoever brought that information to light.
That's a very interesting point, because I saw that Lukashenko made 2 points to the media just a few days ago. One was apparently a Russian plan for essentially a takeover of Belarus, a substantive takeover, was released. And I would have expected them to stay silent on it or deny it, but he said to the media, yes, such a plan did exist. And then possibly in connection with that is Russia had been pushing forward a narrative that Ukraine might be inclined to make a move against Russian troops in Transnistria. And they were using that, to suggest that they were aggressive, outside of their territory. The Ukrainians have denied they have any intention of that. They're just keep some troops stationed, defensively, because there are Russians nearby. But in any event, Lukashenko came out and said, no, I don't think the Ukrainians are going to do that. It wouldn't make sense for their interests. And so it's interesting to me that Lukashenko was happy to undermine the Russian narrative. And I'm wondering if that might be the first sign of a little bit of daylight between them that we've heard in a while. Balanced, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, I mean, you need only look at the fact that the prevailing credit system that's presently used with regards to cashless payment is UnionPay. That is a Chinese platform that's utilized. So I agree with John with regards to the already exploitation that's being thrust upon the Russian citizenry through the illegal invasion of Ukraine, and subsequently the whole payment system. That's just one element. If you look at consumer goods, it's very difficult to establish how many goods Russia is importing, whether from Turkey or from China, and we're talking about just typical consumer goods. But you can look at what Turkey is exporting and sort of just a number there, and attempt to try and establish through in-country feedback on what consumer goods are Chinese now. In fact, they were not Chinese prior to the invasion of Ukraine and subsequently the sanctions that came. With respect to Belarus and China, I'll credit Piotr. Last night, he had stated in another space that there was a already prevailing agreement between China and Belarus that was defined as an all-weather, comprehensive, strategic relationship, a partnership. So it would be interesting to review that text. It might be interesting for some to review that text and see what potentially would be discussed, whether it's something relating to the all-weather, comprehensive strategic partnership, or a calling in the chips, so to speak, and utilizing Belarus. This is just a far-flung theory, utilizing that all-weather strategic partnership to call in the chips from China, so to speak, but they don't typically like to have their hand called. And also, if we know pre-invasion, Putin and Xi Jinping had met, at the Olympics, and there was a commitment that was provided to, operate with no boundaries within the two countries. So, yeah, lots of interesting things coming in the following week. Thanks for giving an opportunity to speak on the nefarious actions of China and their ultimate desire to uh, define themselves as the global player as opposed to the United States and others.
Thanks very much, Balanced. Just before continuing, we have a few hands. I'll just remind you, we have a decent conversation going. If you'd like to contribute to the conversation, just request a mic and we'll bring you up to speak. If you're enjoying what you're hearing, please do retweet the space. We'd like to draw in, as many voices as we can. One more piece of content, or I guess two more, that I've added to the nest in case you haven't seen them. The second item back is, I believe it was the Washington Post who broke some information that, besides the initial conversation was about whether China might provide drones to Russia. And the Washington Post article up there discussed the possibility they're considering sending artillery ammunition as well. And then besides the blinking comments that were referred to earlier, just the other day, the CIA director, William Burns, was on with, I think it's CBS, and he gave a number of comments on several different issues, but one of which was the fact that he was confident that the Chinese were considering providing this kind of equipment. So that material is there for you. And just sort of relating to the theme of the space, some people might say, well, why are we talking about geopolitics? How is this OSINT? And I just wanted to note that intelligence analysis requires things to be set in context. And so, you need to understand what's going on in the world and what the different motivations of various players might be, because otherwise you might not be able to interpret a piece of data. And so, while some of these reports come from, mainstream media, there's nothing wrong with that. That's a different type of intelligence, and it's all from open sources. And so that's why we're not just talking about analysis of satellite photography or looking at, equipment losses or unit movements. It's about understanding the entire, the sphere of the question, because it will help you in other ways. I think the order was Brad, John, and then Exit. Go ahead, Brad.
Yeah, so about 8 years ago, I came to the conclusion that China was scary because of their manufacturing base. And what could make them a truly deadly adversary is a situation where all of our manufacturing is outsourced to China, and we've let our internal, manufacturing capability kind of go. And that applies to, just manufacturing generally, but specifically to our military-industrial complex. The idea that, if China were to pivot its manufacturing and just go all in on arms production, that's a really, really scary situation. In terms of what China wants out of this, who can tell for sure, but it would certainly be in China's interest if the West, to string this conflict out and have the West just go through, our ammunition stockpiles as much as possible, in case China wanted to invade Taiwan. So I've posted in the, not in the nest, but down in the thread, and Michael, you can repost to the nest if you want, a report from CSIS. I don't know, Piotr can tell me if I pronounce that correctly. And then one other report that follows it. The first one, I think maybe they're both from CSIS. The first one talks about kind of the state of U.S. Stockpiles of different weapon systems and what we're low on. Obviously, it's not a comprehensive list. And then the second one is about production lead time for different weapon systems. And, you know, this has been a rude wake-up call for us. Now the thing that I'd love to get somebody else's opinion on, who knows more about this stuff, is, you know, there's a certain amount of overlap of weapon systems that, you know, would be used by Ukraine in that theater versus what would be used in the South China Sea. And so I'd love to hear if anybody knows anything about the state of inventories that would be specifically germane to a conflict where China attacks Taiwan. Anyway, the other thing is a weakened Russia is also in China's interest. So, I mean, if we think about the global West, the global East, the global South, if anybody follows Alex Stubbs' work, China and Russia are conjoined twins, essentially. They're bound at the hip in this thing. They, just like any set of conjoined twins, they probably don't want to be. And like some sets of twins, sometimes in the womb, one twin absorbs the other. We all know which twin would be absorbing which other twin in this case. But for all intents and purposes, in my opinion, we need to be looking at Russia and China going forward as this, it's the same polity, it's the same desires and interests in many ways, not entirely, but I do think looking at them as a global East, but China being the greater of the two, and having an undermined Russia gives them negotiation leverage in terms of exploiting Russia's resources. I'll leave it at that. I'd love to hear anybody else's opinion on that. But those reports are interesting. I think minding stockpiles is super important as we think about what's in China's interest as they seek to stretch this thing out.
Thanks very much, Brad. With regard to your specific question about munitions that might be relevant to the defense of Taiwan, it's a great question. I think maybe we'll save that for down the road. So if anybody is going to speak to that, maybe hold on to it. But hopefully we'll make that a subject of a future conversation. I think I'll go balanced. I saw you wave. Did you have something you needed to come in right away on?
Yeah, first thing I wanted to do was just briefly, and then this will be my last comment. Thank you so much on framing up the importance of combining the open source intelligence aspects with the geopolitical understanding of what's going on in the world, to be able to contextualize why the investigations occur, and also to lead the analysts and investigators down the path as to why something looks the way that it is. By you adding that 30-second explanation, you are able to frame why people even do open source intelligence, and at the same time, why they're paired with cross-cultural psychologists, why are they paired with geopolitical analysts, those types of things. And so I just wanted to thank you for doing that. That's critically important. My last point, when Brad had stated, and I like Brad a lot, when he stated that Russia may be, the subservient or the subordinate, twin to China, I would say this: China is in desperate need for Russia to win this war with Ukraine. They need them to be conjoined together on that level, not just because China is as big as it is, has a larger economy than Russia, has a larger manufacturing than Russia. They've modeled practically everything in their society to Russia, and so having that sort of global running partner is key critical. So adding a little bit of texture to what Brad had stated, I just wanted to share that. Michael, thank you so much for putting together that brief statement about the geopolitical ties to OSINT work. So critical for people who are unaware to understand why that's so important. So thanks. That's my last statement, and thanks so much for the space. It's really remarkable.
Thanks very much, Balanced. we'll go through hands just because we have several up. To the extent you can be as brief as possible, that would be appreciated. I believe it was John, Exit, and then Constantine. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, just a quick recap. Michael Bond said intelligence analysis needs context. That quote right there was definitely 100%. It kind of sums up everything that Balance just said as well. I think it was Brad's point, I would say you got to understand that by the time like U.S.-China relations have boiled down to kinetic warfare, and it's also important to remember that the hybrid warfare, the battlefield is very hot. It has already been going on for years, or you could even say more than a decade. I think the decoupling of industries will have already happened for it to even get there. Like, we're not going to fight China if our industry is in China, I would just say that. But I would disagree with the idea that, but like also like it's just quick. I'm trying to be as brief as possible, but I would like pseudo disagree and agree with that they're joined at the hip. I do believe they're joined at the hip, China and Russia. But I do think China needs Russia. Maybe this is more so me agreeing that if China was ever to get into kinetic warfare with the West, right, they're not going to be able to fight off the whole West, and then Russia would play a key part in kind of holding a lot of these European Western nations, not even just militarily, but in like the economic fight, but in kind of holding these Western nations and saying, hey, Russia's still here. And I think that's a big Balance made a great point, saying that China needs Russia to win because Russia still needs to be a viable threat for China to make a big move kinetically against the United States. Russia has to be a viable threat to the West because the last thing China needs is the West kind of doing, and I think they talked about in their points, which is going back to Piotr's point of how reactionary this is. They even talked about how unilateral sanctions cannot be a thing anymore because they saw what it did to Russia's economy. And they understand that if the West were to gang together and do the same to them, and someone actually in your last space, Michael, mentioned how that the same type of sanctions against Russia on China would be even more debilitating to China because of how ingrained their industry is with the West. So China understands that can't happen, and then you kind of see them kind of voicing that in these peace, quote unquote, peace points. So I think China understands that Russia needs to still be a viable threat at the end of this war, and they can't be totally hollowed out.
Thanks very much, John. I believe it was Exit and then Constantine. And again, if we can keep comments brief, we'll try and get through everybody. Go ahead, Exit.
Yeah, so I guess my comment would be that maybe the peace plan plays both sides in a way. There's specifically an article that I read this morning. I put it down in the replies. Just back to what Balance was saying, that article noted specifically that in parts of Russia, the union pay system isn't actually working anymore. And it seems like China's starting to draw back on that. And specifically to the peace plan, I wonder how much of that is kind of trying to hold Russia into their line as well, just purely based on the fact that they mentioned the Black Sea Grain Initiative and the need to cooperate with the UN on that project, and that's a really important thing. The fact that they even mentioned it at all kind of surprised me, honestly, and the fact that they're encouraging cooperation on that. When you couple that with the fact that they are the leading exporter of Ukrainian grain, I just wonder if there's room for interpretation on all of that, and that maybe they aren't playing one side or the other. They're playing both sides, really.
I mean, that would be consistent with the views of some of the earlier speakers, it sounds like. But I also was surprised that they specifically called out the Black Sea Grain Initiative in this plan. So I appreciate that point. Before going through the hands, Jacoby, did you have something to add?
I do, but I don't need to go before anybody. Go ahead.
Okay. I think it was Constantine, Wolverine, and then Piotr. Go ahead, Constantine.
Hello, everyone. I just wanted to say that this is, first of all, this is a huge major development for Ukraine. If China starts supplying shells to the Russian infantry, it's going to be much harder for us, and this war is going to take longer. And if people, if there are appeasers that are saying that this war should end ASAP, this specific actions by China will prolong the war by a really long time. Also, I do think that I do agree with, I think it was Brad, that China actually wants Russia to be weakened, and China has its own plans for Russia. And I think many people understand that, but yeah, they're not allies. China and Russia are not allies. Those are two dictatorships that basically have, their own view of the world and their own domination. They can be situational allies to some extent, but they're not allies in any other way in the long term, or even in the short term. They're not really big allies. Just wanted to say that.
Thank you very much, Konstantin. I would be curious also if anybody has any thoughts on if Zelensky does meet with Xi, and I have heard unconfirmed reports that Xi may not be open to that meeting, but any thoughts on if they do have that meeting, what the odds are of Zelensky making progress, convincing China to, either remain neutral or, in fact, support Ukraine on certain points. I understand it's very hard to prove that, but if you explain your reasoning, then sometimes that brings forward interesting details. I believe it was Wolverine and then Piotr. Go ahead, Wolverine.
The only thing I wanted to say about was whoever said it was before about the ammunition producing and stuff like that. The people have to remember that the U.S. normally does not do something like what we're doing right now. Last time we really did it was during World War II. So the production rates that the United States had for their own ammunitions was sufficient, mainly because the way that we conduct operations, which is what Ukraine is getting trained to do, but they still are learning it. We rely more on accuracy than we do actual amount of artillery on rounds on target. And so because of that, the amount of ammunition that we produce is sufficient for our purposes to conduct our combat operations. And when people say, the United States, should have been thinking about this or whatever, well, not really, because the United States this is not something that we normally would do. We wouldn't be involved in something like this normally, especially since we're not directly involved in it like World War II. So when somebody says that, the United States should have been producing more, or this is lacking on their part or whatnot, I would tend to disagree with it, just because we do our combat operations different than a lot of other countries do. And, so when I hear comments like that, it just kind of like, it perturbed me too a bit, because they don't look at what we do and how we do our operations compared to a lot of other countries.
Thanks for that, Wolverine. With this idea of China potentially providing artillery, we had a conversation the other day about building more information to understand Western artillery ammunition capacity, production capacity. I believe the gentleman who was particularly curious about it was named Cameron. Maybe now is the time for some among us to try to dig into detail on Chinese artillery production capacity, which may be relevant beyond just this connection to Ukraine. But of course, we'll see. Piotr,
sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
The only thing I was going to say to that is that their current production, I would actually, if the Chinese are no longer using 152 and 122, because my understanding, which I have to double check, is that most of their gun systems are going to 155 caliber. So if their production rates if you look at it, yeah, they may be producing a lot, but you got to look at specifically what caliber are they actually producing. If they're not producing any more 122, 152, then anything we get that's now is for their 155s, which is going to be irrelevant to the Russian military. It's going to be what their old stockpiles are. And it's kind of like, like we joke about where, it's like if we see T-34s, all of a sudden getting thrown into this war, I wouldn't be surprised because they probably got like 1 million in storage. The same thing, the Chinese have been producing those munitions for quite a long time, and they probably have vast stockpiles of 152 and 122 ammunition on hand.
You make a great point. Of course, I had assumed their stockpiles would be massive, but I was curious about production rates. But you make a good point about the caliber, of course. Piotr, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I just, what was your query, Michael? Maybe I can take a stab at that. But the other thing I wanted to say is that I think the Chinese, again, some people probably hear what I say and then sort of underestimate the Chinese capacity for, I don't know, smoke and mirrors or the military element to it. At no point should we underestimate the Chinese, willingness to potentially increase their engagement or involvement with this vis-a-vis the supply of ammunition to Russia. I just remain very skeptical about it. It's incredibly difficult to tell what the Chinese are thinking because, as the Chinese balloon showed us, they don't have the desire to have direct linkages to the Americans over the balloon, for example. I'm aware that they do have the systems in place, a hotline or whatever equivalent, but they don't seem to be conducting themselves to the same set of principles as we've seen in the Cold War. And given everything else that's going on internally for them, I think we're just in a very it's definitely this added element of fog of war, right? And I think that the Chinese say one thing but can often do a very different set of things, much like any state can, to be fair, but the Chinese are notorious for that. And I think it's sometimes just best to watch exactly how they respond, like, say, with Lukashenko tomorrow, right? Because Lukashenko, Belarus has long been a bit of an enigma in this war. What has it been, 5-6 times the Ukrainians say that the Belarusians are going to come in and then they never do. So it's interesting that now we've got a direct state visit from Belarus to China. The Chinese element in the war, but also just today, Saudi Arabia's leader is in Ukraine. He's pledged, I think it's $400 million. But also then China is in Saudi Arabia. So we've got this network, this spider's web, this smorgasbord of players and chess pieces and checkers pieces, or whatever the hell you want to use, right? Moving around in very abstract and unpredictable ways. And I think it's, as I say, I think the greatest driver of all of this is going to be just what happens on the battlefield itself. Often we think about politics driving the war, but sometimes it can be the other way around. And I think that will be the case now, because at this point, only so much diplomacy can come into fruition if neither main, actor in this conflict, either Ukraine and Russia, are willing to do anything themselves directly. No matter what other diplomatic efforts are made, they're all just on the periphery. They're all just sideliners. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that as well. And sorry, my phone is being really bad, so let me just mute myself.
In the event you can hear and respond, the question I had been musing about was if Zelensky were to meet with Xi, whether by personal appeal or whether by some kind of leverage or value that Ukraine could offer to China, whether there'd be much likelihood of Zelensky appeal swaying Xi from whatever course they're on at the moment. I don't know if you have a thought on that.
Yeah, I think Zelensky's messaging and information, warfare, or his flying around different parts of the world to appeal to the humanist and moral sentiments that many of us have about the conflict, I don't think will have as much of an impact, if any at all, on President Xi Jinping. Clearly, they're their approach to human rights. I'm not saying the West is again rid of any of its own hypocrisy, but the Chinese clearly don't have human rights as a high priority, civil liberties. You know, we can see that from the Uyghurs and more. So I just don't think if Zelensky were to engage President Xi, it would be along the same lines that we see him doing with the British Parliament, US Congress, and so on. What I do think is really interesting though, and this I saw just been passing on LinkedIn this morning, I encourage anybody who is a nerd, maybe you, Michael, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, I'm joking, to go and source up the Ukrainian-Chinese Treaty of 2013. I was not aware of this, but there was quite an impactful treaty from 2013 that the two countries signed. And the contacts that I have on LinkedIn basically just drew my attention to the fact that there is, if we think about it, the Chinese. Oh, here we go. I can read it to you now. So in 2013, the Chinese-Ukrainian Friendship and Cooperation Treaty was signed, concluded for a duration of 25 years. That was signed between President Xi and then Viktor Yanukovych on the 5th of December 2013. The content of the treaty is very instructive. The huge debt of gratitude the PLA de facto owes Ukraine for past mil-tech transfers and consultations, mostly during the 90s and 2000s, helped them, begin advancing their blue water navy. That explains, this person argues, as to why China doesn't throw its full weight behind the Russian invasion. I mean, I think it's also just because of the economics, but also I just think it's really interesting. So basically, because of a provision of Ukrainian technological and advisory support to the Chinese in the early 2000s, 90s, this is influencing the Chinese attitude to Ukraine. But it goes the other way as well. If you look back, how much have you actively seen President Zelensky criticize China's positioning? Not much. I can't really think of it on the top of my head how many cases where I've seen him overtly criticizing China. He's maybe frustrated or makes implicit remarks, but I don't think I've actually heard him actively call out China specifically. And I think it's really interesting. This person argues again, paraphrasing, completely alienate China at this time, as it would be catastrophic if China started to throw its full weight behind Russia. Let's see here. Yeah, so the treaty talks about China's pledged support for Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity, including apparently a security guarantee via the Budapest Memorandum, and to compare that to what China is not doing for Ukraine today. She points to Article 7 in this treaty, which China, through its refusal to hold consultations with Zelensky, is in direct violation of Article 7. So I will see if I can source up this treaty and put it in the nest, but yeah, it's really interesting and quite funny that you asked that question, right? As I found this on LinkedIn, but it's I think it's highly revealing why the Chinese and the Ukrainians are both not more overtly, positioning of one another on the wall.
Well, that's very interesting. That agreement, I'll admit, had not been on my radar, so I do appreciate that. And if you have a link either to it or with a description of it, that would be helpful. We'll go through the next couple of hands. We are only wrapping up, I think, finishing item or question 2 of 5 that I had. We were likely not to get through all 5, but I do hope to get through, at least one more conversation. I'm thinking about running the space for about another half an hour. I'm generally aiming for about a 3-hour conversation, just so everybody can manage their timing. John, would you like to go ahead?
I actually hold my point so that we can get to some other questions, actually.
Sure. Brad, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, just real quick. On the China topic, if I were Zelensky, I agree with Piotr. I don't think Zelensky's typical tact would play well. But if I were him, I would basically have several case studies of Russian incompetence and basically show how, because of their disregard for human life, they've essentially created they've turned what was an incompetent military force into just a completely disastrous military force. And part of the reason for that, I guess one way of a technical way of explaining it is in network theory, it's called structural holes. And I have a very long blog post on this topic that I just posted to the thread. It's specifically applicable to this situation. The next thing I was going to respond to was Wolverine. I totally get what Wolverine was saying in terms of him not liking maybe what I said about depletion of U.S. stockpiles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think one of the points that I was trying to make in that is that right now we're in a situation where we are arming another country that, while they operate in ways that we've trained them to operate, they still don't wield the full capacity of the way that we do things here in the United States and NATO. So in a situation where we are arming another country to defend itself, quantity does have the quality that we need. And so I think in many of those cases, our production capacity for even weapon systems that we would probably not even really use too much starts to become really, really important. And I think that's all I had.
Thanks very much for those points, Brad. I see, John, you've decided to wade back into the fray. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry about that. Speaking directly to Brad's point, I would say that so CSIS talked about how our long-range fires, and this kind of gets into someone else's question of like what type of weapon systems would be used in the different theaters, Ukraine, Russia versus the Pacific theater. But they talked about how long-range fires, which is something that will be very prevalent in any type of Pacific war, our stockpiles will be depleted very fast. Like we don't even have the stockpiles right now. And speaking to Wolverine's point of how, well, kind of how like the idea that that's how we fight versus how like kind of they fight. We wouldn't have. I think this is just an opinion. I would say that we would be reverting to kind of this not as the lower the weapon systems we have that are on like the lower technological or the lower like in the spectrum of technology or lower advanced wise. I think you see us reverting to that just kind of in the same way, maybe not the same way and not as drastic as the Russians are. Like I'm not saying we're going to be pulling out M60s out of storage a year in to any war. Arguably, though, tanks wouldn't even really be a big player in a Pacific war. But the point I would say is that I think the problems that plague traditional military like Russia would plague us as well. And so we may maybe in the outset of the war start to fight that way. But if we don't gain overmatch tactically and strategically very, very, very fast, you're going to see us reverting back to some of the same stratagems that the Russian military is doing right now.
That's a valuable perspective in terms of people may assume that capacity is military capacity is a static thing, but certainly there's a sharp edge of the spear, and that if it's diminished, different countries have different depth of that sort of leading edge, but that it is limited for everybody. Wolverine, go ahead.
So if you're saying reverting back to like what Russia does, I would completely disagree, only because of the fact of the stockpiles of the systems that we do have and what we'd actually need to use in the Pacific theater. When you look at artillery, we only in the United States we only use 3 systems. Okay, the M119A3s, the 777A2s, and the 109er A6s, which are being converted to 109 A7s or new platforms. And the thing is, this is when you look at our artillery structure and what we have for assets compared to the Russian and the Ukrainians, they have multiple platforms. Some that use the same cartridge, munitions across the board. Some don't. But they actually have, systems running from 89 millimeter up to 203 millimeter. There's even one 152 millimeter gun that can't even use the same ammunition, say, as like a 2S19 and the 2S65 MrBond. Okay. Uh, our ammunition for the U.S. is the same across the board for 155. All our guns are set up for it. All our guns have, I mean, we have the computers, we have the GPS, and a lot of that stuff is just not present on the Russians, is not present on majority of the Russian systems, nor are they present on the Ukrainian systems. Even the stuff that we gave them, they're good systems, but they're not as good as what ours can be because of what we send over when we send, export weapons for export to other countries. So we don't have to worry about the logistical nightmare that Russia has to worry about, because realistically, if you look at it, like, example one, we only have 155 and 105 millimeter. Now, even the 105, 105 is, prevalent, but the units that have the 105s also have 155 guns. So does that mean if they run out of 105 that they're screwed? No, because they still have 155 millimeter guns. And we have a lot of 155 millimeter guns. Now, let's say we had to go back into stock for, let's say for some reason, okay, hey, we're running out of 777s, we got to pull out 198s. 198s are an old gun, yes, but those guns are still, as old as they are still more accurate than majority of the systems that they're actually using over in Ukraine right now. I would definitely see I would definitely rather see some Marines out there or soldiers running a 198 compared to having to run whether it be the two S65s or something like that. The other thing that goes along with it is training. Okay, and look at, and this is, you can see it everywhere. You see these Russian or Ukrainian troops doing their fire missions. And what you need to do is this: look at how the Ukrainians run their fire missions and how the Russians do their fire missions compared to how the U.S. does their fire missions. Okay, the U.S. will sit here and in a heartbeat drop, 9 rounds within a couple minutes. Okay, one gun with a great trained crew. And the thing is, this is that we can sit there with the battery, put out 18 rounds faster than some of these Russian batteries and Ukrainian batteries can put out, in a 5-minute time period. And it's because of training, and that's the biggest thing is that, our guys are so well trained that that's what they do, So it's not, even if we reverted back to using like our old 198s, okay, they just had to learn a new gun system, and the 198 is in ways easier to use than the 777. But it's just because it's no system. But it doesn't mean that system is any less accurate or any less reliable, because that's the gun that we used in Desert Storm. We used it in Somalia. We used it in OIF. We actually used it in Iraq from all the way up till God knows when, and it was even used in Afghanistan before finally getting replaced by the 777s. So there's a lot of different things you have to look at before you just say automatically, oh, you guys are going to run to this. Especially when you don't understand or see what their training is and how they run their gun missions, how they counter batteries and stuff like that. It's just watch videos of how they run their guns, and you're going to see the difference between how they run their guns compared to how we run our guns in the United States.
So I do appreciate getting down into the weeds, and I recognize the value in everything that Wolverine just added. In terms of whether, it's an interesting question how the United States might fight if they didn't meet with immediate success. And I have seen 1 or 2 articles written on the same. I'm not sure it's all that relevant to the line of discussion we had going. So, I'll go to you, John, but maybe you can be brief in that we don't want to get right into technical details at this point.
Oh yeah, definitely. Everything Wolverine said was right on the dot. But that's just awfully specific, and I was more so talking about the opening salvos of the war, which will be counter battery fire, artillery exchanges, or any type of close in bombardment, like tactical bombardment. It's going to be like salvos of long range fires, which is what's expected in any type of the opening of days or hours of any Pacific kinetic warfare, the outbreak of such. And that's why I highlighted long range fires. I was just making the parallel that you'll see us, fall back on. We don't have that many JASMs or LRASMs. You'll see us falling back on our stockpiles of Tomahawks. Not saying they're any less capable, which in certain aspects they are less capable, but they still get the job done. It's the same thing with our Harpoon missiles. You'll see us falling back on those and other things like that. The problem is our stockpiles still don't in a large scale, and the same thing could be said for China, right? All these things they're showing off and whatnot, and honestly, any country this could be said for who has a conventional military capability and also like a blue water navy. I think it's just a natural thing that you see. You fall back on these kind of like essentially legacy systems is what you call them. I'm not saying we're going to be going back and flying around F4s or anything crazy like that, but I think, like, for instance, the F-22 or the F-35, you'll see those fielded, but then eventually we'll start to realize it's not cost effective at the attritional rates that Pacific warfare is expected to be, to keep fielding these aircraft when you can really get much of the same job done with an F-15. And I think you'll see us falling back on this systems that were not necessarily latest generation systems, but you'll see us falling back on the latest immediately prior generation to all these new generations of weapon systems across the board. And I think it just makes more sense to do that. And I just think it's kind of the natural course of things, because those are what we have our stockpiles in. But everything you said on artillery, especially with the training thing, the training aspect is definitely a big thing as well. So,
interesting back and forth from two guys who know these issues, in tons of detail. So I did want to move on to another question, and it's essentially encompassed in this first tweet that's in the nest. It was put up by Phillips O'Brien, who's a professor of military strategy, who's been very thoughtful on the entirety of the war. And he's asked, can we declare that the Russian campaign against Ukrainian power generation has been a failure and potentially counterproductive? And so that's the question I was hoping to get into a little bit, to move, to maybe kickstart the conversation. If you look at some of the items I've put in the nest, it includes, there was that breakdown in the resources section that Exit spoke to at the beginning of the space. I'll put that back up in a moment. That broke down the attacks against energy infrastructure by Ukrainian region and by time, showing that there has been a bit of a drop-off in the last month or two. At the same time, we have interesting reports from some well-known OSINT accounts like Ben Du Brown. So his is the 5th post back in the nest. He's released an OSINT report titled Weaponizing Winter, which is reviewing the Russian campaign against the Ukrainian energy grid. But, so it definitely has been a major effort. But to that end, we also see, and it was quote tweeted by Phillips O'Brien, I'll put it up separately in the nest, that Ukrenergo, which is the Ukrainian energy company, has actually come out and said there are no power deficits in Ukraine at the moment, and that I believe they even came out and said the Ukrainians may begin exporting electricity to other European countries, so they may actually have an excess, which number one is good economically, but number two, it just goes to show that all of the Russian strikes have not done nearly as much damage. It was a problem for several weeks, but that the rate of repair has been so impressive that essentially they have more than enough for their own use, which is honestly, I consider that amazing. Connected with that is the fact that the spring is on the horizon. So several tweets back, there's a tweet up there by David Helms, who has been very consistently and I think impressively tracking the weather forecasts in various of the Ukrainian regions. because it matters to facts on the ground. But the weather forecast, of course, also goes to how much energy Ukrainians need to heat their homes. And we can see that in the next week or so, temperatures are going to rise so that both night and day they're above freezing. And during the days, they're going to start hitting double digits in Celsius temperatures. And so heating will still be required, but the demand for that heating is going to go down quite a bit. At the same time, yesterday, the UK Defense Intelligence Group, who put out their daily updates, had focused on the availability of the Shahed drones. And we had seen that attacks against energy infrastructure had partly relied on those drones. And so with estimates that their availability is decreasing, that calls into question the ability of Russia to continually attack Ukrainian energy, at least in a systematic way. So from my perspective, these things are adding up in terms of spring approaching, Ukraine producing enough electricity that it can actually export it, decreasing availability of Shaheds, that maybe the answer to Phillips O'Brien's question, can we declare that it's been a failure? It's coming out as, yes, it has been a failure. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I would love to hear your opinions. We'll go to Wolverine first.
So the only thing I read a couple of different things, and this is not like current, but it was like kind of like when all this stuff was going on. And the one thing which actually was like a great example is that lots of times when these power places got, I say power places because it's going to be either transformers or whatever it may be. Some of these places when they get hit, it's the shrapnel. Sometimes it can be a small thing as just having to repair or splice a cable into it, or replace transformers and stuff like that. And one thing that had actually helped is that I know that there have been a lot of countries who were promising and did actually send electrical components to Ukraine to help them repair this. So that's good because it gives them the extra resources they need to repair them. And like I said, sometimes you can have a substation go down just to one cable getting hit, Yeah, you got to shut the substation down. You got to find the cable that's hit or whatnot. But to do the actual repair, sometimes it's not that long. And I think that's one thing that helped them is that with all the resources they were getting in and the extent of the damage, it tells me that if they're able to actually export power, that main components of a lot of these different sites were actually not damaged, but it was the smaller components or cables and wiring that were actually hit, which are actually, in the whole grand scheme of things, relatively easy to repair. And I think that's why they've been so successful at being able to keep their energy grid up. And now, like you said, even to the point now where they're actually even able to export power to other places.
I think those are good points. I know that in prior spaces, we've also had some detailed conversations. I don't know that he's joined us today, but there's the account Russian Bridges Go Boom, who I think has some knowledge of infrastructure. And we've had conversations about how really there are some very critical parts that are hard to replace. So I take your point, Wolverine, that damage might be minimal in many cases. But I think the worry for a period of a couple of weeks was some of the rarer pieces of equipment, particularly the very heavy transformers, because they didn't run on exactly the same mix of voltage and hertz as the majority of countries that support Ukraine, and they had therefore sort of a limited pool, often coming from other ex-Soviet countries for some of these critical parts. But it seems like most of those problems must have been overcome. Go ahead, Wolverine.
Yeah, the only thing I said, like when you talk about the hertz and all that, so this is kind of like the good thing, like in the United States we use 120, 60 hertz. Believe it or not, almost everywhere else in the world uses 220, 50 hertz. It's actually almost the same. Any country that runs 220 is also running like the same hertz. I've dealt with in the Philippines and I dealt with in Iraq. Obviously, two different places, and a lot of the stuff that they run in Iraq is actually goes off the British standards of how they do things. So a lot of those components actually would have been, the biggest thing would have been probably transporting, like if you had really big transformers or something like that, getting those into the country. But otherwise, that is most of the stuff. And somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, yeah, I've only been in a couple of places, but I mean, I deal with electricity and some of the work I do like that, and that's most of it. What I've seen is, a lot of it over there is 220, 50 hertz, I believe.
Yeah, I'm not too worried about getting right down into the weeds, but I can maybe connect you with Russian bridges. I think the point he was talking about was mainly more voltage, because apparently their sort of backbone distribution network runs on a slightly different voltage. I can't remember if it was the standard in many Western countries was 760, and in Ukraine it was 733 or 7. It was some odd number. But I see Exit putting her hand up. She might be able to correct me just on that one point.
Actually, I was just noting that I put the statement from Ukrainigo up in the nest from today, and they note that they did have disruptions in power in the Odessa area up until yesterday, but they've now solved those as well.
Okay, thanks for that. It does sound like, they may still face regional issues. I know at one point in Odessa, they had talked about how they had an outage because one of the I think it was a transformer station that had been struck and repaired. The repair apparently didn't suffice or didn't last long enough, and a fire broke out that then led to blackouts for a few more days. And so it's not always, we made the repair and everything's okay. But I think the order was John and then Gurney. Go ahead, John.
Just a quick point I would make is that if you look at the Russian, long-range decapitation or just long-range strikes in the beginning or even the first year almost of the war, up until very recently, they focused on military targets. Targets were essentially, I would say, the delegation of the type of fire that they were delegating to take out said targets were more strategic fires, I would say. And so I think they kind of failed to kind of do the same thing as we saw like in the opening of Baghdad or in 1991 or even in 2003, this inundation of fires on the infrastructure, specifically the energy infrastructure of Ukraine. And they kind of caught on to that late almost, and they kind of caught on to a lot of things late, doctrinally. That's just a point I would definitely make which kind of furthers the point that they have failed, and I think they arguably failed from the beginning. As soon as the majority of these strikes were not hitting, using these strategic weapon systems to hit non-strategic assets, all of a sudden you kind of realize that they kind of didn't get the memo on the implementation of these weapon systems.
That's an interesting perspective. Gurney, go ahead.
Yeah, hey, thanks for having me up here. I'm going to make a reference, or I sent a photo of this to one of the co-hosts here to hopefully post in the nest, because I'm not too good with that. But what I want to bring reference to, and I'm going to, John, I love hearing your input here. I'm going to challenge you on this and sort of, some of the ways we come to assessments, and what is posted in the nest here is a 1994. It's an advanced war studies thesis by an Air Force gentleman. Let me just get some names here so you can actually understand what I'm talking about here. So bear with me 1 second. Thomas E. Griffith, Major USAF. Okay. This is a thesis that was presented. It's available out there on the internet for you guys to read. School of Advanced Air Power Studies, Maxwell Air Force Base, Alabama. Okay. This was back in '94. But John, to your point here about looking at the effects, I'm not disagreeing with your comment there, but just even in remembering something like that version of Desert Storm, and the assumption, I'm just going to assume there was an assumption implicit in there for you, John, that there was devastating effects upon Iraq. And it's interesting because if you go through this, there's a long form thesis here, but in that there's some case studies, and he lays out in a grid there. You can see some case studies: Air Corps Tactical School, World War II Germany, World War II Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and he talks about the amount of things destroyed. And for Iraq in particular, he lists over 90% of that electrical infrastructure. And again, this is a thesis that looks at just electrical infrastructure attacks. So I thought it'd be relevant to your conversation here. But then, discussing the effects, and I'm just going to make a short synopsis here. He characterizes it morale medium, cost of leaders medium, forces high, production low. But in terms of actual impact, his statement is saying not known, perhaps temporary confusion, but no paralysis. So I just want to go there and say, even in looking at some of the examples, that we think we remember in our head, especially because there was devastating electrical infrastructure attacks that occurred in Iraq. I would just say, I'm not disagreeing with any of that, but I would say it's better to look at the outcome here in sort of the frame that this Air Force Major General was doing that. And I think it fits in the spirit of the question that Michael's asking here, steps that the Russians, took. Aside from those steps, even if the best case was done, would the outcome be effective? And what I like about this thesis here, he comes to some conclusions. And I would encourage everyone, instead of just me reading it, that you go out there and take a look at it and give it a read. And if you don't read all 60 pages of it, to at least read some of those tables that he has in there, and at least the conclusion in there, which, to paraphrase it, that even with 90% destruction in some of these cases, that the effects are extremely limited, and have little little chance of succeeding in terms of grand strategy, although they can be highly effective for specific effects. And he lists, if you needed a hydropower dam taken out of the way because it was producing something, extremely strategic for World War II, or hydrogen or heavy water. Other than that, it seems to have a lot of blowback. But I like it because he looks at it from an actual case study perspective. So thought I'd add that to the conversation. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much. I had seen that report a week or two ago. I didn't think to include it today, so I really do appreciate you bringing that up. And that actually goes to the second part of the question that was posed by Phillips O'Brien that inspired me, which is, has the attempt to attack the Ukrainian energy system been counterproductive? Whether, in opportunity cost, in that it could have used those munitions on military targets, or to, hopefully we won't see it play out. So we'll get an answer to the question I'm about to pose. But Ukraine has also announced several steps to mitigate the effects, including starting up smaller scale power generation that's more widely distributed, and also taking some of their transformer control stations and so on. And as they're rebuilding them, they're actually putting them underground. And so I can dig up tweets to those effects, but that starts to beg the question: even if Russia had maintained a campaign against Ukrainian energy infrastructure at a pace similar to, say, November, could Ukraine have adapted through these two means, smaller production and greater protection by putting some items underground, so that ultimately a campaign would have failed regardless? I think is an interesting question. At the same time, just before going to John, one other way in which it could be counterproductive is that Bellingcat and others have identified the specific individuals who are generating targeting information for these cruise missiles. And I have definitely seen debates that some of these strikes against energy infrastructure may constitute war crimes as being against civilian purpose infrastructure, and that for some of the targets, the argument for it being dual military purpose don't seem to hold up. And so it may ultimately be counterproductive in the sense of some people facing a tribunal over them. John, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, you make actually a great point about the war crimes. But one thing I would just say on that note is that I think Russia has basically thrown out the idea that they care about whether or not the world sees what they're doing as war crimes. Ultimately, they know that unless we can get them in a courtroom, they won't have much other than sanctions, which are already being levied against them at an alarming rate and have been for a while. Alarming to Russia, not necessarily me, but I think Russia doesn't really care about that. But then what I would say is, if you look at what the goal of attacking someone's infrastructure is supposed to be, um, and Gurney made a great point about the what was the outcome? Okay, so how much are they actually destroying? And I think they might have been able to have better outcomes had they done this early in the war. And so if you look at what the goal is supposed to be, primarily it's supposed to demoralize the citizen base, the populace, because hey, we're living without electricity, or we don't have water, or gas, or this or that, right? Which is not something you do once it's already been proven that the Ukrainians have the morale to fight a long war. So that's what I was talking about earlier, about how maybe if they had even tried to attack the infrastructure at scale early in the war, they didn't even show the initiative to do that early in the war, and they're coming around to it late. But this is not the time to do it, because trying to affect the morale of the citizens, it's kind of late for that now, because it's been a year on just this past week, and we clearly see that the Ukrainians have the willpower to fight this long war and fight it until this war is done. Whether they win or not, they're going to fight it to the end. And I think Russia is just totally out of sync with the Ukrainian mindset of their populace as a whole, and more importantly, their will to fight. It's a great point. So arguably, I would say they have failed, right? Because one, they're doing it way too late. And two, they're not doing it with the munitions they would have had at the beginning of the war to actually destroy a lot of these things. These stockpiles of Iskanders and whatnot. They don't necessarily have these stockpiles anymore, and now they have to use them very, very, very sparingly. And so now they're using these non-strategic weapon systems, i.e., Shahed drones, to try and take out the infrastructure of Ukraine. But obviously, there's limited there's limited potential for damage with these drones, because just strictly talking about explosive power. Versus where if they had all these Iskanders they wasted on small groupings of Ukrainian forces, could have been gone to. And I'm glad they didn't, but I'm not saying I wish they had. But if they had done that, they may have reached their goal faster and may have actually reached the goal of damaging Ukrainian industry to the point where it's not possible for them to go forward and keep prosecuting the defensive war.
I agree with you on the timing issue, as in, if they had wanted to pursue it as a singular strategy, they would have needed to do it beforehand, and that it seems like they don't have the capacity for it at the moment. But counter to that, even though the UK intelligence update had suggested they believe the stock of Shaheds is running low, that there are in fact air raid warnings right now for several regions of Ukraine with reports of Shaheds having been deployed. So they do still have some left. One other consequence, that may have made this whole campaign counterproductive is by using up all those Shaheds. I wonder a little bit if they ultimately realize that a campaign against Ukrainian infrastructure, energy infrastructure specifically, will not succeed. What do they do next? Are they going to reserve their cruise missiles for military targets? Are they going to? Will the value of Shaheds and similar drones from Iran go down? Will that negatively affect the close connection between Russia and Iran, if they start pursuing a different strategy because they realize this one is a failure? Yeah, John, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think you make a great point. Like, what's next? Once they, realize, whether it's late or now, arguably now is late already. But that this going at it from this angle is not going to work. But I think they may be low on these, and this is just me querying that they may be low on these just because they're talking with China about purchasing ZT-180s, which are almost mirror image of the Shahed drones. They're loitering munitions. Now 100 may not indicate. Now 100 would indicate that maybe that's kind of a low number that I would think personally. So maybe that would indicate that they are going about they're going to use these drones differently, maybe more on the tactical level, and stop trying to influence, strategic change or strategic wins with these drones that are arguably a tactical weapon. I think what's the page that they were talking about before? I followed them as well, talking about this new, like, not necessarily doctrine, but this new this this book found talking about maneuver warfare and the Russian military. Maybe that does signal a change in their thinking. Arguably, we haven't seen it. Wolverine made a perfect point about how, well, we're still not seeing them even applying to this new force structure or force design, because at the end of the day, if you can't fulfill that, if you don't have the things that are in those tables, you're going to have to make do with what you have, which arguably the Russians haven't shown themselves to be good at all. So I do think that maybe they're going to try another go at this with Chinese drones, bolstering their stockpile of loitering munitions. It's kind of remains to be seen. The Russians, they constantly surprise us. Sometimes they're competent, generally less than they are, but they always surprise us constantly about their strategic and tactical decisions. Who knows? It's like weird that they're just kind of discovering, and obviously they haven't discovered it because Wagner was employing these and have been employing these tactics in Bakhmut. This whole idea of small unit warfare, small unit tactics. But like it's just getting into writing now. This whole idea that hey, maybe we don't just throw as many people at them as we can, and then eventually we, the idea of maneuver just doesn't. It's oddly confusing to me.
Thanks very much, John. Hopefully, the Russians don't even get the chance to make Chinese drones, their next step after this. So I will turn to Gurney in just a moment. Before that, as we're getting near the end of our conversation today, I wanted to highlight a few events. So if you do look up in the nest, our next conversation will be this Thursday. I'm trying to hold these spaces Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern and Sundays at 4 p.m. And so please do set a reminder for that. We'd love to have you join us then. That earlier today, we had some friends of ours who also, were discussing Ukraine, and they're very focused on that issue. Appreciate their insight. That's a new account called Tochny. It was their second broadcast ever. There is to it, I believe the recording should be available there, so check that out. And then for those who haven't had enough spaces today, there's another conversation this evening hosted by Aaron, and there's a link to that in the nest. It starts at 10 p.m. on my space on Thursday. Do check out Tochny's space from earlier this afternoon, and Aaron has a conversation tonight at 10 p.m. And with that, I'll give Gurney the last word.
Oh no! Don't do that. No, not last word. No. I was just gonna.
I'll come in and save you at the end.
I was just gonna, John, I like your comment earlier, and I think Michael had sort of spoken to this as well. Just you're questioning, what is the utility of those missions or those strike missions. And I just wanted to point people's attention up in the nest. There's a conclusion page from the end, so to save you guys from having to read it. But John, to your point there about whether those Shaheds could be used elsewhere, it seems very similar to the conclusion of the Air Force major then in this thesis, in that aside from potential blowback and other things, or even if you can do that, right? He questions whether or not this is something that is useful for the missions, because it always comes at the cost of other missions. And to just basically say there, the time and effort might be better spent concentrating on intelligence methods for attacking these systems in future strategic air operations, as opposed to, so attack, spend time to do the intelligence and research on that. And perhaps what this can say to us is perhaps the Russians can't identify through their intelligence where the Ukrainian military assets are or production facilities. So it's removing that step and going for the electricity. I mean, if we're to assume that they're attacking the electricity to make some sort of impact aside from morale and stuff like that, but impact on production or war effort. But this gentleman, I just like to raise it because it's one viewpoint, and I think it was a great conversation tonight. So thanks, guys.
Thanks very much, Gurney. Well, we also, I'll highlight an item that Exit put in the nest, which it's an article from Medusa that says that there's no sign that Russia plans to stop targeting Ukraine's electrical infrastructure. And so even if we might say that it's a failure and it might be counterproductive, it looks like it may continue for some time, even if at a pace that is either slower or maybe at the same time unsustainable. At the same time, somebody also put a reply in the thread here that noted that about a week ago, Ukraine may have done some rebalancing of their sort of backbone electrical network, a result of which means that even with the same amount of electrical generation capacity, it may be more evenly distributed, which is reducing blackouts so that the overall uptime is higher, which is entirely possible. Today, I had set out 5 questions. We really discussed 3 of them. 2 of them remain. One was whether there is likely to be a breakthrough on the seizure of Russian assets. We tend to keep moving economic questions and kicking the can down the road, which is kind of a shame because, as many of you know, that's sort of my specific area of interest, but we'll get to them eventually. I partly left these last 2 to the end because they're not exactly time sensitive, but there was the question of Russian asset seizure, and then the other was what steps we could take to build our capacity to monitor the progress of a coming Ukrainian offensive. And some caveats around that. We would want to do that obviously without violating Ukrainian operational security. But my thinking is, obviously the offensive will not be for several weeks, but we do have some time to build our capacity in terms of, building keyword monitoring lists for, say, critical towns, signing ourselves up to important Telegram channels that we might not already be on. We can build our capacity a little bit. And so I had intended to have a bit of a brainstorming session on that. But I'm mentioning it now so that if it's the sort of thing you're interested in, please do go away and think, how can I build my capacity, to stay more abreast of the breaking news. And of course, we'll have a brief discussion about how to do that responsibly, to protect operational security. Perhaps I'll kick that issue to our conversation on Thursday. So please do join us then. I think that's otherwise it. So I'd like to thank all of the speakers. We saw lots of regulars. I appreciate everything you bring to the space. Thanks to Jacoby, Polaris, and OSINT Engineer for co-hosting with me. And I look forward to chatting with you all again in just a few days. Have a good night, guys.